Order, and welcome to this week's Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, where we are looking at the Clean Power 2030 mission, and we have our first panel to understand the viability of the 2030 target, the technologies that will provide the most effective route to reaching 95% clean power by 2030, and what levers would speed up progress to 2030. We have three members of the first panel. I will ask you to introduce yourselves very briefly, starting with Marcelle.
Hello, very nice to be here. My name is Marcelle McManus. I'm a professor at the University of Bath.
Thank you.
Pleasure to meet you all. My name is Stuart Dossett. I'm a senior policy advisor at Green Alliance, which is an environmental think tank and charity.
Stuart.
Afternoon, Adam Berman, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Energy UK, which is the industry body for the energy sector.
Well, thank you all, and you are very, very welcome. I will start with the first set of questions. Is the government's target of 95% clean power generation within the next 5 years genuinely achievable? Who would like to go first? Stuart, thank you.
Kick us off. I think it's definitely ambitious, but I do feel it is achievable. I think what we can see so far is there's been a huge amount of energy and intensity from mission control and broader government on this, but that's a level that's going to need to be maintained right through to 2030 and beyond. And I think achieving clean power 2030, it's important to point out at the outset, isn't just about net zero, it's about energy security, the affordability of electricity for households and businesses. It's about stimulating economic growth, and it's about unlocking a clean economy as other sectors decarbonise through the 2030s and beyond. But there's certainly some very big challenges to overcome in achieving this plan. So the first one I'd highlight is the renewables build rate that's needed to be achieved is massive. The next two contracts for different auction rounds need to be procuring up to 52 gigawatts of wind and solar, of which 20 gigawatts of that is offshore wind, because of the build time for those to be online by 2030. So that would be 10 gigawatts at least in each auction, which is double what was achieved in the last auction, which itself was a record-breaking amount. Second thing I would highlight is that we need to bring onto the system new forms of clean, flexible power and a massive increase in demand flexibility that will include some first-of-kind new technologies such as hydrogen for power, which ultimately will be the technologies that displace gas from the system. On the networks, the NESO analysis shows that there's 88 transmission projects that need to be completed for 2030 to be achieved. 85 of those, I think they said, have delivery dates for 2030, and 3 they need to expedite, but keeping those on track while also ensuring the appropriate level of environmental protection and community consultation is going to be a really big challenge. And ultimately ensuring that the Clean Power Plan doesn't increase the cost of electricity and reduces it wherever it can is of fundamental importance.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to move on. Marcelle, anything to add?
Yeah, so I would say it is a mammoth task, but it's one that we have to achieve. And I think, just to add to what Stuart said, I think one of the ways in which we can achieve it, as well as providing more generation, is to look at demand management. So we really need to look at both sides. So we're not just looking at putting new renewable technologies into the system, but really looking to see how we can actually reduce demand or change demand within industry, within industrial clusters and on the domestic scale. And that will then enable us to balance the network a little bit better and to reduce the rush to get more technologies on board between now and 2030. Sorry.
Thank you. Adam.
Yeah, so maybe just to give a private sector perspective, I think industry stands firmly behind the ambition of the 2030 plan. Just in terms of a few missing pieces that maybe just to add to my colleagues' comments there. The first one I'd say that the demand side really is probably the biggest single piece of the puzzle that we've not yet cracked. And as a result, you get these wide estimates of what's actually possible in terms of households and businesses turning up and down their energy usage depending on need. There's huge potential there that is largely untapped, and it requires a lot of different policy levers to get there. To date, we've had focus mainly on the kind of big infrastructure, big generation, big transmission. That's crucial, but so is the demand side. Gas, whether we like it or not, there's going to be a lot of unabated gas still left in the system for quite a few years to come. The NESO modelling bears that out. We need to come up with a convincing pathway of how to both phase out the unabated gas whilst maintaining investment in it so that you can keep it going, you can keep the personnel there, you can keep maintenance going, and then phasing in the low carbon alternatives. And at the moment, there's not a plausible, I think, gas pathway forward. And the final thing is bills. Bills are left as this giant question mark underpinning the whole plan. And I think from the perspective of industry, it's not good enough just that people come out roughly on par in 2030 in terms of bills as where they were in 2024 or 2025. We need a cheaper energy system. There are lots of ways to do that, but I think that really needs to be a core focus of 2030 plan as well.
Thank you very much. Right, one from each of you. What are your top recommendations for ensuring Clean Power 2030 is met? Marcelle, you want to go first?
So I think building on the demand reduction, I think we need to have localised and regionalised strategic plans to enable us to ensure that we're getting the power to the right places at the right time so that we can electrify industry.
Thank you. Stuart?
I'll go with the renewables build-out. As I mentioned before, there's a huge, unprecedented amount of renewables that need to be procured through the next contracts for difference auctions. There are some routes that private business can bring these on through power purchase agreements, for example, but ultimately it's the CFDs that are going to be bearing the backbone of this. So ensuring that those next two auctions procure the amount that we need is of fundamental importance.
Thank you. And Adam?
Yeah, and just to add on the CFDs very quickly, I mean, two auctions, yes, on fixed bottom offshore wind, it's one auction. It's AR7. This is the final auction this year in which we can procure the amount of capacity needed. I'd probably make a couple of points about grid and connection. The first one is, there's lots of work going on in relation to grid, but adaptability in relation to the connections queue, I think, is going to be really important, and making sure that if market interests don't perfectly align with Clean Power 2030, then we have some flexibility in that connections process. Secondly, distribution network is something that I think has been to date treated as a kind of second order priority to transmission. We really need to treat it as an absolute priority, which means holding DNOs to account on timelines. It means standardisation of fees, standardisation of connections process, more granular data, lots that can be done there.
Thanks very much. That's very consistent with what we've heard elsewhere. To what extent is there tension between meeting clean power by 2030 and net zero by 2050? Adam, you go first this time.
This is a juicy question. Okay, look. I think if you take net zero with an economist lens, then you'll try and attack the cheapest emissions first. You go for the cheapest emission, then the next cheapest emission, and the next cheapest one after that. Clean Power 2030 doesn't particularly look at net zero in that way. It just looks at a particular sector and says, let's get rid of lots of emissions from that sector. And wisely, the government has put the emissions reductions plan at roughly 95-96%, because those last 4 or 5% of emissions are incredibly expensive to abate, and frankly it's a much better use of your time to look at harder to abate sectors like road transport or buildings. I think where it's really positive in terms of net zero is that electrification is the gateway to the decarbonisation of the whole economy. And so we are going to need lots and lots and lots of clean electricity to power that. But what I would say is that you can't view either net zero 2030 or net zero in a vacuum. And, the let's say renewables developers that I represent, they're not just looking at Clean Power 2030, they're looking at what is my consistent demand going for my product, for my electricity, going to be through the 2030. So that means they're looking at things like the Clean Heat Market Mechanism, what's the demand going to be from heat pumps? They're looking at things like the ZEV mandate, and is the demand going to be from EVs? And so what I'd say is net zero is absolutely interlinked with Clean Power 2030, but it also means that in order to get success from this programme, you also need success from other programmes under the net zero umbrella.
Thank you. Stuart?
Yeah, I echo everything that was just said, and I guess enforce the fact that many of the other sectors of the economy are going to start to electrify and decarbonise through the 2030s. Having a clean power system in place by 2030 that can then expand through the 2030s to meet that really significant increase in demand is going to make that job much easier. And to build on the point around the interlinkage with the other plans, I think the one in particular is the Warm Homes Plan. So buried within the NESO advice was quite a telling stat that I think is really important here. So if the government achieves its 2028 target of 600,000 heat pump installations per year, in order to get the demand reduction from residential electricity that you need to be installing insulation measures in houses at twice the rate that the Warm Homes Plan is targeting, for example. So this, I think, just really highlights the crucial interdependence between the Clean Power Plan and other areas of government priority.
Yeah. Thank you. Marcelle?
Similarly, I would echo what's just been said. I would say also that I don't think there's a huge tension between doing this, because we need to have this clean power by 2030. But whilst we're doing that, we need to be also thinking about what's coming next. So we can't forget the next steps, such as the wider circular economy. And if we've got clean power, then we're not using fossil fuels. So how do we defossilise the rest of the economy around us to get to that net zero target by 2050? And I think that's really critical. And it's a huge nascent industry and technology which could really put the UK at the forefront of innovation between now and 2050, 2040.
Thank you. Is 40 billion a year between 2025 and 2030 realistic to you in delivering the 2030 target?
Now we just start off from the industry side. There's no reason why 40 billion isn't completely plausible, but it needs to be met with the same level of ambition from the incentive structures that are in place. So the CFD will obviously be the primary one on the generation side, Rio on the network side, etc. And I think all I would say is we have a lot to achieve in very, very short order. We don't really have time to try little kind of pet project ideas. And so if you look at just AR7, for example, the latest CFD round is going to take place this year. There are a set of ideas on the table. One of them, for example, is that projects can actually, they lower the eligibility requirements, and projects can bid into that process before they've got their DCO, their consent order. That runs the risk of you ending up with projects that essentially aren't shovel-ready and probably that don't deliver in time for 2030. And so once you look at all of these incentive mechanisms, we just have to recognise you could reinvent the wheel, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it works today and we know that the CFD works, let's leave it as it is. Let's set it so there's a competitive auction. We drive down prices. We're procuring as much as we need, but not playing around with the rules so that we're putting at risk the amount of capacity we need for 2030.
Thank you. Marcelle?
I think I will probably leave the detail of this to my more industry colleagues. From the academic perspective, we like to see sufficient investment, but I will leave it to my colleagues to answer.
Yeah, good.
I think that figure of 40 billion shows exactly why the Clean Power Plan is also so central to the government's growth mission. That's a huge amount of capital investment, large quantities of that coming from the private sector that have an opportunity to really stimulate regional economies up and down the country. So I think it should very much be seen as an opportunity, not as a cost.
Great. Thank you very much. Mike Reader.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk around the balance of technologies, and perhaps we'll go down the road starting from you, Marcelle. So what technologies would provide the most effective route to meeting the 2030 target?
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the demand management and the sort of the way in which we can have the integration of the renewables with demand management. We have seen a huge increase in wind and solar, and I think we need to continue with that, but we do need to look at how we increase the amount of storage. There's different ways in which we can do that. We can flex our demand, and I think that's really important, and I think that's something that is becoming a bit of a barrier to net zero. And we have the storage, but I think also that electrification to our industrial clusters and the big industries, so that we can take that demand more flexibly and stop curtailing when we have periods of high capacity. I think that's really important as we go forward. So I would say not just a balance of technologies, but the balance of technologies and infrastructure is absolutely critical to this.
And what about enabling systems then around those technologies? Stuart, anything more to add on that?
So I think renewables are obviously going to form the bulk of the system, and they're crucially important to get right. And we have a very well-worn mechanism, the contracts for difference, that's going to bring those on. I think on the demand flexibility, there's a whole range of things we can get into around sort of smart meter rollout and ensuring and half-hourly market settlement that ensure that the appropriate structure in place that consumers and businesses are incentivised to use their energy flexibly. Then the third section is around the kind of clean, flexible power component of this. So the government is putting in place a long-duration energy storage cap and floor mechanism, which works similar to a CFD, for example. But the timelines for that the first projects to be expected delivery by the end of 2030. So the timelines are already very long. So I think while we're obviously talking about 2030 today, we need to be keeping that in mind, that the power system is going to continue evolving beyond 2030. It's going to be increasing massively. And what we need to be doing is bringing those clean forms of flexible power, be it long-duration energy storage, such as pumped hydro, compressed air energy storage, or hydrogen, for example. We need to be bringing those onto the system as quickly as we can so that we can diversify our security of supply mechanisms. I'll leave it there.
Well, my next question was actually on storage, so it's good that, thank you Marcelle and Stuart for picking up. But Adam, what's key to getting enough storage? And actually, do you think there's enough focus from energy on the storage needed? Because we see a lot of focus on generation, distribution, transmission, but is there enough focus on the storage needed to make 2030?
I think there is a growing focus on it, and in fairness, I think this government has come in with some big ambitions there, and we've seen, for example, consultations on things like cap and floor mechanism for longer duration storage. I think, look, there's two ways of looking at storage. The first is the road to 2030, and then is the road beyond 2030. I actually work backwards. Beyond 2030, I think there's very little thought as to what that's going to look like, and when you've got a high-pressure system over Western Europe, so frankly there's no wind anywhere, and you've got that for a week or two, what are you going to do to fill the gap? You can use gas, but obviously we want to phase out unabated gas. And I think there remains, for those longer duration periods, I think a bit of an unanswered question, or at the very least pathways that are going to take quite a long time to eventuate, from carbon capture and storage to hydrogen to power, etc. For kind of up to 2030, we are starting to see the right technologies being invested in. I mean, there's an incredible pipeline of batteries. In fact, there may even be at a certain point too much investment in batteries, and so you're seeing in the connections queue prioritization process a discussion about actually some of the batteries being moved to the back of the queue because there's too many of them. I think that's really positive, but certainly the government does need to do more to think about how we can be incentivizing them, because so some of this, particularly the longer duration storage, the lead times on these projects are just as long as the lead times for any substantial renewables project. So we've really got 12 or 18 months at this point to make that work.
Do you think industry feels confident that the government's got a grip on that?
We have heard lots of positive noises from the government. The challenge with 2030 is that no single part of it can fail if you are going to reach that target. This is certainly a part that has had less discussion than others, but we've seen, for example, a low carbon flexibility roadmap, which the government has said they're going to come up with by the summer. The engagement process for that has started. So I think all of the signs are there that the government's taking this seriously.
So Stuart, what role do you think new nuclear, SMR, carbon capture will have in achieving 2030 specifically?
In achieving 2030, I'm not a deep expert in those two technologies specifically, but I think from what I've seen, the likelihood of significant amounts of carbon capture and storage within the power sector or small modular reactors is limited by 2030. I think this comes back to, again, the point around how does the system evolve beyond 2030, and how are you optimising the system to both achieve 2030 but ensure a system that is well geared towards the 2030s, when you're going to see a very large increase in electricity demand.
And given the quite substantial costs, do you think we've got the right balance in terms of our focus? I'd ask Marcelle, perhaps, in terms of where government's going in terms of renewables versus these kind of more unproven technologies.
Well, nuclear is obviously a proven technology.
Nuclear, yes.
Yeah, but I think we need to be looking at all sorts of options at the moment, and I think what's really critical to the industry that I work with, who are investing in some of them, working with us in very early stage TRL energy systems, is that they have a reluctance to invest in things if they don't see a pathway to how this is going to be coming into the future. So I think for the new renewables and the biorefineries and these type of technologies, we need to have some system to enable people to invest in that and take it beyond the early stage research. I think, as Stuart said, we're at that cusp between what we can do now and what we need to invest in the future to get to 2050. And I think that's the tricky part, where we really need to have some careful thinking. And I think the industry who I'm working with are definitely of the opinion that consistency is key. Mm-hmm. So they need to have consistent policy, consistent frameworks for investment which go beyond the conventional financial sort of modelling, for financial timescales, just to make sure that they can invest and they can be safe and take that risk in some of the more novel things, which we're sure will get us beyond 2030.
On that point around risk and perhaps riskier technologies or more less unproven, does government need to be clear on discarding those in the short term and what they focus on so that we do achieve 2030, and the riskier stuff or the more unproven stuff that actually government disincentivises to make sure that we hit our targets? Adam, Stuart?
I think the problem with the riskier technologies is the question is, what do you want from them? And what I would say is I think there's a big link to the industrial strategy here. Let's take a newer technology, floating offshore wind, for example. Floating offshore wind, just to take the last CFD auction results, it's about double the price of fixed bottom offshore wind. So it's the same wind that's turning, it's the same turbine. You get no other services from it. It's just double the cost. So you should hope that in paying double the cost, A, you're able to bring that technology down the cost curve, but B, probably more importantly, you're able to actually establish a nascent domestic industry within the UK and actually lead globally on that. At the moment, we have a bit of a left-hand, right-hand problem where we have, for example, floating offshore wind. We just had the largest floating offshore wind project globally procured through the last allocation round, but no real sense that we're exploiting the possibilities either on the manufacturing or on the services side. I hope that some of that will come out of the industrial strategy, but at the moment, that's a bit of a question mark.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful towards our supply chain industrial strategy inquiry, which we're about to start.
So I saw.
Very, very grateful for your evidence there, Adam. Luke Murphy, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the panel for appearing today. Ofgem's proposals to reform connections to the grid, what do you make of them?
Shall I go first and then feel free to jump in? I think the overarching proposals to align the connection process with the Clean Power Mission is one that makes an awful lot of sense. I think once you get under the bonnet of it, there's obviously considerations that need to be made around ensuring that you don't disincentivize investment that may otherwise be coming forward from organisations if they're feeling like all of a sudden they're going to have no opportunity to connect and are going to be pushed way down the queue into the 2030s and beyond. The other thing that comes to mind on this is around given the connection queue is going to be prioritised based on the target ranges within the Clean Power Plan. I think one of the things that, talking to the previous question, is the ranges for clean, flexible power and long-duration energy storage were arguably lower than I would certainly have hoped for. I appreciate that this reflects the readiness of various technologies, and it'll be interesting to see what the low-carbon flexibility roadmap comes through. But I think one of the things we really need to avoid with the connections reform is disincentivising those new technologies from actually trying to get onto the grid even by 2030 and being more ambitious than the government sees for them.
The other thoughts from...
Maybe just to take one other aspect of it. I mean, we're years behind where we should be on connections, and that's primarily because there has been systemic underinvestment because the regulator has denied industry the possibility of investing ahead of need, and that has been the regulatory landscape for essentially the last decade. One way I think to think about how we can solve that specific problem is ensuring that we can get the skills base and the supply chain needed for the expansion of the grid. And I think considering a mechanism like the advanced procurement mechanism, so thinking about how we can actually secure funding and components years ahead of need is going to be really interesting for lots of different parts of the network. And that's something I'd like to see Ofgem go further on to ensure that we're not in the same problem. The connections queue, it's recently been closed because it got so big. The connections queue is not going to get any easier, frankly, over the next few years. So anything we can do to get ahead of need is going to pay dividends.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I would also say that I think we need to be pulling in a lot of the discussion around who gets involved with these connections and where everything lies. We need to discuss this with the communities around as well. So if we're having extra power systems put on these, we need to be involving the communities that they're within.
Can I come in a quick supplementary on that then, Marcelle? Is there a case then for derogations or priority? You're giving priority connections to schemes that involve communities or are fronted by communities?
Yeah, potentially. I think to get to net zero, it needs to be sort of this whole. We need to have this discussion. We need to have people on board. We will be seeing changes and we can't not have these changes. So we need to have people willing to be part of that.
Adam, what's the industry think about being incentivised?
Well, look, I don't really have a strong view on this except to say that we get lots and lots of different folks coming to us asking for prioritisation in the connections queue, whether you're a large housing estate, a new commercial estate, whether you're new renewables or your industrial site. That is largely a matter for government to decide how they want to prioritise that.
What do you think government should be doing?
I think that the issue at the moment is around investment, and I think that a little bit of meddling at this point is frankly necessary because of the mess we've got ourselves into. I would probably caution us not to go further in prioritising certain parts of the economy over others, because at the end of the day, you still need people to come in and build the generation and build the transmission infrastructure, and you do want a certain amount of clarity and certainty over that.
I'm interested in that because I think there seems to be a kind of consensus that the current rules have not worked for all kinds of things. But Marcelle's point about public consent and support is pretty crucial, as well as the investment. So if we get the investment and everybody hates it, no one's going to like you, no one's going to like us, and everyone's going to end up going, why on earth have we got all of this stuff? So there's got to be when you talk about meddling on the rules, I'd be interested to know what kind of consensus we can perhaps recommend of what those rule changes might be that facilitate the adoption of renewable projects and reaching 2030, which is eye-wateringly close in this context of energy, which also make sure that you've got the public consent for it, because otherwise that's going to slow you down.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think the government's position here has been that community benefits is the way in which they will look at this problem, but that there will also essentially be a public comms campaign to try and foster the same spirit as we had in the 1950s and 60s when we built out the transmission infrastructure at scale post-war. I think, beyond that, there are some ideas, although at the end of the day, these are like any nationally significant infrastructure project. If it is in the national interest, you do get that clash between the national and the local, and it is a real challenge to deal with that. Whether a speeding up of connections for particular communities would necessarily facilitate that, I don't know. But at least as it currently stands, the government is minded to view community benefits as the central way of dealing with that problem.
I'm going to go back to Luke Murphy, but there's a lot more in that set of questions. Perhaps if you can come back to us in writing, that'd be really, really helpful. I'm going to go back to Luke Murphy now. We haven't got time for any more supplementaries.
So I guess in order to prevent current delays in grid infrastructure, is there anything that the government's not doing? We've got Ofgem's proposals to reform the connections. Is there anything that the government's not doing that you would recommend that it should do in order to speed projects up?
Well, if I can answer, so what we've seen, so I've been part of a large UK-based project called IDRIC, which is the Industrial Decarbonisation Research Innovation Centre, and we've been working with the industrial clusters on that, and the key messages coming back from several of these industrial clusters is that we're not getting the connections to companies and industry to electrify fast enough, and that has been a key barrier to decarbonisation.
Yeah,
so it's
really
not just connecting to the power sources.
Yeah, I'd really just echo that. In the rush to get as much generation connected onto the grid as we possibly can, we can't forget about the end users of that electricity, so we need to ensure that the demand is also able to connect to the grid in a timely manner.
I would just say make a decision on REMA. It is a massive albatross around the neck at the moment, and no one knows which way the government is going to go. That is for them to decide. But you have these huge programmes of work, 2030, Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, REMA. At the moment, they're just simply not joined up, and some clarity on that, I think, would be useful to making decisions.
Since you mention it, zonal pricing, what is the panel's view on what impact zonal pricing would have on investment and the clean energy 2030 target? I appreciate any reforms wouldn't come in until after 2030, but Ofgem, NESO, Citizens Advice, all quite independent organisations are all leaning towards / recommending see the benefits of zonal pricing, but there are a lot of developers out there obviously who say, well, it'll increase the cost of capital. What's your view?
I can start off wading gently into this debate. Look, the first thing to say is I'm sort of, I think the view of industry, and slightly surprised that independent regulators are coming out opining about policies here, there and everywhere in the UK. Ofgem is an economic regulator, it's not a policy think tank. Look, there is a short-term problem, which is that, you know, as you put it, the government's not considering implementing any of this until after 2030, but nonetheless, we have a lot of investment we need until 2030, and in the very, very short term, the government has said, we'll make a decision in time for AR7, the Contracts for Difference round this summer. I think there's every chance that if the government makes a decision in favour of quite substantial market change so close to an auction round, that auction round could well not go the way the government wanted. And, you know, the CFD process is a bit of a last-minute process anyway. If you're a developer putting in your bids, you get the auction parameters really at the last minute, and you spend about a month doing your due diligence, and then eventually you'll kind of put in your bid. What essentially the government is saying is, we're going to radically transform the market, and we'll give you a month to figure out whether a 25-year asset is doable and at what price. So I think that's a slight issue. Beyond that, look, it's always been for the government to prove the case for locational pricing if that's what they want to do. And I think the challenge has been, how do you maintain investment in the very short and medium term with some of the challenges that are going to eventuate from locational pricing? The REMA programme has gone on endlessly now, 2.5 years, still with not enough information about really crucial elements like grandfathering. You know, how are you going to grandfather in presumably significant portions of renewables and non-renewables clean capacity into a locational marginal pricing world? There is still not a single detailed policy paper from the government as to how this would work. So it's very hard for me to sit here and say, this is a great idea or this is a dreadful idea without all the evidence.
I think I'm just echo and build on that ultimately we are undertaking a Herculean, I think as Finton slightly keeps calling it, task to decarbonise the power sector by 2030. Anything that casts doubt or uncertainty in the mind of private business, who, as we talked about with the 40 billion of investment per year, which is primarily coming from the private industry, anything that puts that in doubt, I think, is not a welcome distraction at this point in time.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
We've gone a bit over my time, and I've taken time from the next questioner, but luckily that happens to be me. So on to planning. So it takes 4 years to determine applications for development consent, but we know that most projects needed for 2030 have to begin construction in the next 6 to 24 months. So what are your proposals for how the UK government should overhaul the planning system to get the renewable infrastructure we need, wind turbines, solar farms, pylons and other energy infrastructure up and running within the next 5 years?
Well, I'm not a planning expert, but I would say people are critical to this, just to come back to that people part. And we need to be turning any social inequality into social equity. And we have a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity here to do this in a co-created way to make sure that it happens.
I think they're taking some sensible steps. So the update to the National Policy Planning Framework to align the generation project scale with the level of authority for signing that off was a sensible step. Grid connections prioritisation is obviously key to this. I think one of the things, again, is I keep coming back to the clean flexibility and the long-duration energy storage and the slightly lower target ranges than I would have liked to have seen within the Clean Power Plan, is that the more flexibility you have on the system and the more storage you have on the system, the less big that overall system needs to be. So I just, again, worry that with such a massive push to build the renewables, which is absolutely the right thing to do and is going to be the backbone of the system, that requires us to then also have this big focus on the infrastructure, and therefore we need to adjust the planning for it. But there are other alternatives to get around that as well, and this clean flexibility piece is one of those key ways in which you can end up actually building a little bit less out to 2030 and hopefully a lot less beyond.
Great points. Maybe just the one thing to add, the very unsexy proposal around resourcing, it is a perennial problem, both frankly at a kind of regulator and natural agency level, but also at local authority level that have a lot of planning decisions. One thing that I think could help to drive that is an obligation, particularly for environmental regulators, to make decisions on permitting within 6 months. That would probably have to be married with an expansion in resource. So some money to be able to help them actually find the resource capacity, because without that you'll just be displacing resource from one area to another, which I don't think is helpful to the country's interests, even if it's helpful for the energy transition.
Marcelle, you rightly mentioned that the need to kind of involve communities, I guess, and the Clean Power Plan also talks about kind of proposals for strengthening nature protection.
Yeah.
But many of these projects do need to secure permission within the next 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Can we do all of that? Can we give that, do the planning, get the planning necessary within 2 years for all the projects we need to meet 2030 and implement the nature protections and do the sufficient consultation with local people in order to bring them along and build the support? Can that actually be done in that time frame?
Can I just add something else that I think we also need to think about, just to add
sure.
to your long list of things we already need to think about? The critical reason for doing this is decarbonisation, and when we emit carbon and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere matters. So what we are critically trying to do in the next 5-10 years is not emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we don't want to be permitting new developments which have a huge amount of embodied carbon in them at that point. So that touches back to some of the nuclear and the large, big sort of concrete-based infrastructure that could potentially be problematic from a carbon perspective immediately. So I think from a planning perspective that also needs to happen. Again, I'm not a planning expert, but I think we could do it. I think if we put our mind to it, anything is possible, and we need to do it. We don't have any other option. We need to be doing this, and we need to be doing it quickly.
Just quickly, because you mentioned nature there, and I think this is a really important point, that you set out quite rightly the timelines for all of this going through the planning system are incredibly tight. And the Clean Power Plan is very clear that it wants to act in a nature positive way. But yet the conversations, in the same sentence almost, the conversations around how you ensure appropriate protections for nature within that are going to be happening between government, civil society, industry, are only just beginning to happen now. So the timelines there, to me, there's a lot that's also going to go through before the government's actually had that conversation around how to ensure the appropriate level of nature protection.
I'm going to ask about judicial review.
Oh yeah, sorry. With regards to reforming judicial review, do you have any recommended options to reduce the delays that arise from legal challenges to nationally significant infrastructure projects?
I don't have any with me, but I'd be happy to get back to you in writing on that one, Luke.
That'd be great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Claire Young.
Thank you very much. So you've already talked a lot about demand management, so I think we can probably assume that you all think that it should form a larger part of the policy mix under this government than under the last one. NISA's report to government said level of demand flexibility could increase 4 to 5 times by 2030. So do you think that's realistic? And if so, what kind of schemes would you recommend to incentivise that?
I would say that on some areas of 2030 we are sort of roughly on track. So let's say renewables, yes, there's a lot to do, but we're roughly on track, and if we keep on procuring and increasing year on year, we'll get there. On the demand side, we're not on track, and there are some really, really big mechanisms that are needed to be able to deliver on that. So in order to be able to do any demand management at your home, you'll need a smart meter. Only 2/3 of households have smart meters. It's a very basic thing. We need to absolutely finish off the smart meter rollout as fast as we can. Secondly, market half-hourly settlement. This is a kind of slightly technical mechanism to be able to essentially make dynamic tariffs work. So most tariffs that you'll look at if you have a driveway and you charge your EV, or let's say you have your heat pump, most of those are loss leaders at the moment. They don't work financially for suppliers. You need market half-hourly settlement for them to work. And NISO says, according to its modelling, that from 2028 they presume everyone will be on dynamic tariffs as standard. We are simply not on that pathway at the moment. And the potential is huge. I mean, we've had this scheme called the Demand Flexibility Scheme, which came about at the height of the energy crisis to try and help from an energy security perspective, security of supply. And you've had millions of households sign up to essentially shifting their demand patterns to meet supply. It's been really successful until this year, when NISO decided that they wouldn't produce an availability payment, essentially a payment to ensure that would be possible, that the households would be reasonably compensated for their time. it's really frustrating that we've essentially missed a winter here, but this is a bit of a template for me of how the energy system is going to look in the latter part of the 2020s. It's got an amazing potential, but there are so many moving pieces that are needed to get there. And at the moment, as I say, we see lots of great intention and work on the big infrastructure, but on this kind of more digitalisation agenda, I see less evidence that the government has put us on the right track for that.
And just on the smart metering, so how confident are you that it will be in place by 2028?
Well, with the current regulatory framework, I'm not confident. It's not set up to achieve that. And what suppliers are seeing essentially is you've reached saturation now of households who are willing. It's becoming more and more expensive and difficult to find the next household and the household after that who want their smart meter. So we need to start talking about other alternatives to be able to incentivise those households. And things like the demand flexibility scheme have been a great mechanism to get people talking about this potential, but I'm not sure they've gone far enough. So the government has been a little slow on that over the last few months. We'd like to see some progress.
In what sense? In the rewards they offer, or in the ambition of?
Well, I mean, there's no reward on offer for taking up a smart meter. It's still entirely voluntary and remains entirely voluntary. But it does, households will be able to track their energy usage, and as time goes on, they'll be able to take part in these tariffs and low carbon products and schemes. It is increasingly hard, based on where we are we've covered about 2/3 of households in the UK with smart meters. It is increasingly hard to persuade households of the merits of smart meters. And at a certain point, we probably have to recognise that there is effectively a cost now to the households that don't have smart meters. They are bringing about a cost on everyone else in the system because the system is more inefficient as a result of it. And so I think we would like to see a change in that regulatory agenda where hopefully suppliers and government can come together to think about what is a better solution to that problem. And some of these options are more politically difficult, some of them are less politically difficult. Already you're seeing suppliers offering their kind of cheapest tariffs tend to be smart tariffs. Not all of the suppliers, but most of them. We need to make it all the suppliers. We need to make sure that this is absolutely the cheapest, easiest option for people. At the moment, that's not the case.
Does anyone else have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think we need to ask people why they're not putting the smart meters into their house. Again, it's down to that people aspect of it. And I do have some brilliant colleagues who I'm sure who would love to help out, sort of trying to find, share the evidence they have with this. But also, in terms of demand management, it's not just about smart meters and the digital infrastructure. It's about not using stuff as well. So it's about investment into installation, and as we go forward into sort of electrifying, heating, etc. These kind of things where we're just using less energy is really important. And again, back to that connection to the demand. These electrifying industry so that they can help with that demand management is critical too. So it comes from the industrial side and the domestic side too.
And are there any examples internationally where demand has successfully been manipulated to reduce energy consumption and therefore bills for consumers?
I'd say the Danes have done quite a good job in how they've connected communities and helped communities understand when energy is available and when it's not. And there's lots of little, examples around the world as well. But the Danish have done a good job.
Taking advantage of that, you guys say, ask one final question. Have I got time? Yes.
Yeah.
Taking advantage at the moment involves the consumers manually deciding that they need to take advantage. Do you see further scope for automating this as you digitalise, that you could automate things and therefore people won't have to think about it? Because at the moment they have to do quite a lot of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, ironically, the use of AI can help across the piece. It takes a lot of energy, so we'd be a bit wary about aspects of that. But it can be, when it's integrated with some sort of modelling and planning tools, it can sort of expedite decisions across large problems. And I think that can be very useful. On a smaller scale, the digital, turn your fridge off, for half an hour when the prices are high and the carbon intensity is high, is quite a useful tool. We don't all need our fridges or something like that, 100% of the time. So that kind of interaction is very useful.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned AI. I mean, if other people have got comments on it, but not both for consumers, but more widely across the energy system, do you think it's got or to what extent do you think it's got a role in reducing energy usage and in cutting bills? And just to pick up what you said, Marcelle, how big is the concern that actually it's going to use so much energy that it's a complete waste of time? So if you want to come back on that first, and then we'll hear from Stuart and Adam.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, AI. I mean, the energy consumption is quite vast, but we are beginning to see some potential for it being able to optimise demand management in particular quite well. So I think that it could be something that could be of a net benefit overall, but only if used appropriately and not for I mean, in my case, not for ChatGPT answering my students' questions, for example.
Indeed, although I was listening to somebody saying that the energy used to create the equivalent of ChatGPT is the energy of one medium-sized country for a day.
And that's what we don't want
Almost like you could use humans.
Yeah, that's what we don't want to incentivise. Yeah. But using it smartly in judicious systems, I think, is not a bad idea.
Sure.
I think just adding and linking it back to some of the questions that Luke was asking earlier, I think there's potential for use of AI in modelling the future energy system, and in particular like transmission pathways, where you can optimise for multiple constraints within that very quickly, whereas the current process requires sort of very manual intervention to design different routes.
Yeah. Adam?
Look, on use of AI, and going to Claire's question as well, I mean, there is already some use of AI within the energy sector day to day, and that question of how do you make it easy for consumers? I mean, if you bought a heat pump recently, you can absolutely go on a really manual tariff if you really want to figure out exactly what your energy usage is. Most people don't. They will go on a smart tariff from an energy supplier that offers them something that is essentially driven by AI in practice, that looks at your demand patterns, and it looks at thousands and thousands of other demand patterns to figure out the best deal for you and for other consumers. So it is already there, but there's scope for more, and I think essentially the more electrified the economy gets and the more low carbon tech there is in households, the easier it will be to benefit from it.
Right. Mike Reader, just quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. We talked a lot about consumers and demand management. Do you think there's enough being done with industry, particularly heavy industry, in managing the demand from those on networks?
I think that comes back to a lot of the stuff that I was saying. I think industry demand management is absolutely critical. I think there's huge opportunities there, and many of the industrial clusters and industry they're producing a significant amount of the emissions, and many of them are really keen to make significant progress and are already on the way. And I think that those connections are really important, but I think investing in those areas is critical to 2050 as well as 2030.
Yeah, there's obviously decarbonising industry, but the demand management of the decarbonised energy still, is there enough focus on that from government and from industry in driving down and managing demand better from industry, particularly heavy industry?
No, not currently.
Okay.
Look, there are some mechanisms that exist that incentivise industry to change their demand patterns. You know, it tends to be that it's complicated by the fact that once an industrial unit is built, it's built to operate in a particular way. Would love to see some shift there from the government. We've seen through the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, we've seen some of the possibilities of this, but I think, if I'm being honest, we're actually at a much earlier stage with demand management for industrial customers than we are for domestic customers.
Josh McAllister.
How confident do you think we can be about the projected increase in demand for energy from major changes like use of data centres and AI? I mean, there are some assumptions built into models about the amount of demand that will come into the system. But how confident can we be in the current projections that are there even to 2030?
Well, look, I mean, demand has actually decreased in recent years, primarily driven by energy efficiency. I think, the expectation is that demand will sort of roughly double in the road to 2050. If we really went down the data centre route in force, that might well increase a little bit. But I would say industry is more concerned about the supply side than the demand side just at the moment. That may shift, but electrification is happening, but it's happening in part a little slower than we might like. So yes, you've got the move to electric vehicles, but the move to clean heat is going very slowly. The move to industrial electrification is moving very slowly, in part driven by long connection dates, so that if you need a decarbonisation pathway for your industry, you're looking at hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and then you see a connections date in 15 years and you think, oh, well, I'll find something else. So I think on the demand side, we're slightly less concerned in the short term. But clearly, as we're moving into the 2030s and 40s, that may be more of an issue.
I think here is an opportunity to get private industry bringing on private renewables as well, for example. Not all new generation needs to go through the contracts for difference or other government mechanism. Where you have these new large energy users, they are absolutely ripe for bringing through power purchase agreements, for example, new additional renewables onto the system, and storage as well.
Yeah. I mean, so this is a really fertile area that the government has not explored at all. And I understand why they're focused on the contracts for difference, but this subsidy-free route, the corporate power purchase agreement, which is one which so many companies can't take advantage of, often because of things like creditworthiness. So if you're a big cement plant, you can't take advantage of it because, unfortunately, the members that I represent don't know whether you're going to be there in 15 years' time when that contract ends. So there's lots of ways in which we can help to do that, possibly with a bit of help from friends at the Treasury. I'm happy to provide a bit of information to the committee on that in more detail.
Great, thanks. Annalise Mitchley.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for coming in. I'm going to ask a few questions around public perception, and you've touched on this earlier in the session, going back to what Marcelle was saying about challenge and opportunity. So just to start, how do you think it's going out there, making the case for net zero?
I would say it's a mixed bag. I think you've got people who are absolutely 100% behind it and people who are a little bit more uncertain. Again, this is an area where my colleagues at the University of Bath are doing a lot of research, and I'm sure we'd be happy to provide you some further information.
Great.
I think narrowly within the power sector here, I think certainly no one wants their 2022 energy bill again. And I think there is a clear understanding that came out of that period that building large quantities of renewables and decarbonising the electricity system is a mechanism for securing and assuring us against that kind of price spike from happening again. So I think certainly on that perception, I think the Clean Power Mission has cut through. But what is absolutely crucial within this, and I'm sorry to be the person that brings this up, is that ultimately the affordability of that electricity is ultimately what's going to drive public perception of this, so that there is a value for money assessment test that is within all decisions that are taken within the Clean Power Plan. I'll be interested potentially if in the following session some more information on how that assessment works in practice came out. But absolutely every single decision that needs to be taken in the context of certainly not increasing costs, but wherever possible decreasing costs, because ultimately the energy bill that voters have at the end of this Parliament is going to be every bit as important as what the public perception of it is today.
I think that's such a great point, and even more important that we've just come out of an energy crisis where we spent £100 billion supporting home and businesses' bills, and we've been very quick as a country to forget about that. We don't have another £100 billion to spend on another energy crisis. But look, I think whilst polling systemically suggests that public acceptance for clean energy projects has improved remarkably over the last generation, we've got a lot more to do, and I think Stuart is right that the clearest evidence case for that is around bills, and that people can have a cheaper, warmer home. And if you look at the NESO modelling with some pretty optimistic assumptions about both carbon price and gas prices, the conclusion of NESO is this plan will leave people no poorer than they were in 2025 in terms of energy bills. It does not say that energy bills will be substantially lower. That's absolutely not what the plan says. Although it says how energy bills are decided is a matter of policy. I think some constructive ambiguity there. Look, there's energy bills are too high, and that's partially because we fund loads of energy infrastructure through energy bills rather than funding it through general taxation. I don't think anyone is pretending that at a time of fiscal constraint we're necessarily going to be able to move all of those costs wholesale onto the taxpayer, but probably the single most important thing I think we could do, apart from the kind of demand side response and consumer flex bit, which will be really important to bringing down bills, is rebalancing policy costs. And it's figuring out, can we take some of the policy costs from electricity, where electricity is essentially penalised, it's disproportionately expensive in the UK. Gas is effectively subsidised in the UK as a result. We shift some of those costs over whilst ensuring that there is money available for those that are hit badly by that, and there will be some losers in that, and we need to make sure there's targeted support available for when we do that rebalancing to ensure that no one on average loses out.
Well, alongside that as well, we've got a lot of industrial sectors that are shrinking, and workers and wider communities are afraid. They think that they're going to lose the jobs, they think that the bills are going to go up, and they think that they're going to end up skint. And not without cause. We've seen this recently in places like Port Talbot and Grangemouth. So what does need to happen so people do feel that they have a confidence in this, a real life confidence, not just something in the abstract around GDP growth, but real quality jobs, improvement of living standards, and the cheaper bills point that has been made?
I think there's huge opportunities around the industrial clusters to really have skills training and pivot the skills that are already there to green technologies, green refineries, and really looking at how we can use those skills, those people, and that infrastructure already. And I think that's where the investment is required, sort of building on the work that's already been done within the industrial clusters to make sure that we don't see the same kind of things happening again. And I think the people who are working in these areas are hugely skilled already. So it's a question of making sure that the investment for the next refinery, biorefineries, the next type of technology can be co-located in these areas where we already have skilled workers.
Marcelle, you were saying before about getting support from local communities on these infrastructure projects as well. And we've seen that in the nuclear industry where they have done that successfully. So how do you think that lessons can be learned from that in terms of when quality jobs are prioritised and invested in and committed to through that framework agreement, that you can do that as well, like through the grid infrastructure, for example, and others as well to jump in?
Yeah, so I think as I said, there's huge opportunities. We learn from where it's worked well in order to sort of make sure that we're not losing jobs. I think there's huge investment not huge investment, sorry, I know that's definitely not on the cards, but a huge investment in skills, not financially. And I think we don't need to have a huge financial investment to see a pivot in the ability and just the level of understanding of what could come next in these areas. And I think that's what's really needed to push that.
I think within the Clean Power Plan you see that there's an understanding of the need for a strong skills and workforce base in order to deliver it. You're starting to see bits in other areas. So, for example, there was the announcements recently on the skills passport in the North Sea. Though I know colleagues have views on how those could be improved, which I'll be very happy to provide in writing later. I think what needs to happen, though, is that, as you say, those other industrial sectors around the country, they need to be getting that kind of attention and focus as well, to give people that are working in there support and confidence that the government does see them and that they are thinking about them and that they will be taken with us all as a country as we go through this transition.
And what about some of the language used around this, which can feel quite alienating to people and not normal? Like net zero itself is seen as something that, isn't really going down well. What do you think about the way we are talking about this in terms of a transition, so people don't feel further alienated from it?
So again, that's where I would say we need to be doing this, co-developing these plans. We can't go in and say this is what we should be doing. We need to be going in and saying, how do we, this is the problem. How do we create the solution? I'm very much of the opinion that we can't say this is the technology. I'm an engineer. I work in technology. I've worked in technology for many, many years, and time and time again, I've come to the point where I think, well, actually, it's not the technology that's the stumbling block. It's how do we get the technology used appropriately, or do people want this technology? You know, so it's really down to that communication, and that's why I keep saying, you know, we need to engage the community and get this on board.
Some of the workforce as well are saying that if they retrain, for example, to fit heat pumps, they're going to get paid less. And there's different views on that, but there's a perception that that is what is going to happen. So there's also this to deal with in terms of workforce issues.
Look, I think, you know, the annoying word always to use is clarity, but it's very hard if you are a young person training to be, let's say, you know, you're currently a plumber and you want to be a heat pump installer. You do your training, the training is incumbent on you actually doing your first heat pump job. You have no idea when it's going to happen. It could be in 1 month, it could be in 2 years' time, then you have to do retraining again. At the same time, the government is providing no certainty as to exactly what the pathway forward is. And I do think that across so many areas across the net zero economy, having a clear trajectory is going to be really, really crucial to providing skilled workers, or those that would like to become skilled workers, the ability to know that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, there will be this much demand for their skills. Look, in terms of language, it's clear to me, both because the polling has manifestly changed over the last generation around clean energy infrastructure, but also when you look at things like the Climate Assembly, some people might have been involved with, which sadly died a bit of a death because of COVID, where people came together and really complex issues were one in which people grappled with. They understood the trade-offs, they understood the sacrifices, and they came up with, frankly, a very progressive plan for the government, for any government, to actually push that forward. And I think, you know, people are not idiots. When you present them with this information, they know exactly what has to be done. And I think absolutely there are cases where people feel like the transition is being done to them rather than something that they are part of. And I think that's a problem both for politics and for civil society and for industry, to try and get better at using an inclusive language that makes people feel like they are part of that journey.
A very good place to finish, as I think it sets us up nicely for questions to Chris at start. Can I thank you very much for your evidence, Marcelle, McManus, Stuart, Dossett, Adam, Berman. Thank you also for your very kind office to write to us with lots of additional information and all the things that you want to add. And with that, we will suspend the session. Order. Order, and welcome to panel 2 of our session on how to get to Clean Power 2030, and we welcome Chris Stark, the Head of Mission Control. I think there's another title for it now, which Chris is going to describe to us as well. Mission Control for Clean Power 2030, I've got down here as the full description, and Ben Golding, the Director of Clean Power, but I don't know if you want to say a few words each just about your backgrounds to get us started.
Just a brief introduction from me to say thank you for the invitation to come along and speak to you about what we're doing. That term mission control does have a meaning, and hopefully we'll be able to tell you a bit more about what we've been doing in the department, in a new bit of the department looking at clean power by 2030. But very brief introduction. We're, I think, now 7 months in, so we've done a lot in the early months of this government to try and establish a plan for one of the key commitments of the government to achieve clean power by 2030. That began with a really excellent piece of analysis that we received from NISO, shaping what needed to be done by 2030, and we followed that up with an action plan which contains the basic policy framework that we think is needed to deliver that. I think it's worth saying I don't feel I've wasted a single day since doing this job. We've tried to move as quickly as we possibly can to get towards where we need to be, to allow us at the start of this year to move beyond looking at policies, although I'm sure we will continue to do that, into the key challenge before us, which is to actually get this thing delivered, which is about delivering the grid that we need, the generation and the storage projects that we need on the system by 2030. And you know, it's right at the edge of what we think is possible, and we are very aware of that, acutely aware of that in every day that we do this work. But the more we look at it, the more it comes into view, actually, and that's the exciting thing, because the main reason to want to do this by 2030 and to move so quickly on this is that we're trying to pull through a set of pieces of infrastructure and technologies that we know we will need into the 2030s as we face into the next big challenge for this country, which will be the growth, potentially explosive growth in electrical demand that we are expecting after 2030. So in a sense, this is sort of base camp for that challenge, and we're trying to move as quickly as we can to get into the right spot to be ready for that next big challenge for the country over the 2030s. It's very exciting to do it.
Yeah, Ben Golding, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
So we are something of a double act in that I'm the director of the unit supporting Chris, so I won't repeat any of that, but just to add and emphasise, I think two things. Firstly, that point of 2030 is, in infrastructure terms, very, very soon and immediate, so we're moving fast. The massive advantage of that, we can get right down to the detail of understanding which projects, which grid infrastructure, exactly what needs to be done for that, tracking it, and helping to drive that through. So the immediacy actually in some ways helps to make it concrete. The other thing is just to expand on Chris's point that this doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are very acutely aware that our approach needs to face into the second limb, if you like, of the government's clean energy superpower mission, which is net zero. We see ourselves as building a bit of a foundation for that simply because most of the other sectors of the economy will need to electrify. That increases demand enormously over time. So we do this as a foundation for everything else that needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Chris Stark, you left your previous job as Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust after just 3 months. What was so appealing about this new role? Could you please define for us I think you've defined your responsibilities. I don't know if you've got anything to add to your responsibilities and what the unit does in addition to what you just said.
Well, I'm very happy to answer that question. But let me first of all say to my colleagues at the Carbon Trust, who I met this morning actually because I spoke at one of their events, I absolutely loved working at the Carbon Trust. I spent a long time thinking about where I wanted to go after leading the Climate Change Committee for over 6 years. And the Carbon Trust was a kind of carefully selected place to go. And I had a brilliant set of colleagues there. And they are still speaking to me, so they're inviting me along to events. Put simply, the reason I took this job is because I have spent now close to 15 years advising from the edge, I suppose, of UK government, at least, from the edge of government on what I felt was needed to do to address the climate targets that the country has and the energy priorities that it has. And I've been frustrated over those years that some of the things that we could have moved quicker on weren't implemented. And when you are offered the opportunity to come in to government, and I am a civil servant, but to come in as a civil servant and lead something that is focused on delivering against those objectives, some of which I helped to set, I sort of feel you kind of have to say yes to that. So it's a great privilege to do this job and to have this very special team around me now, very focused on clean power.
Thank you. What have you learned? What did you learn from your time heading up the Climate Change Committee, which you said you did for 6 years, that you've been able to bring to the new role?
Well, the reason I do it is partly because we had done quite a lot of analysis on the needs for the energy system and the power system. I'll make these distinctions while we were in the Climate Change Committee. So I had a brilliant time leading the Climate Change Committee over a very important period, I suppose, where the country was interested and keen to see more ambition on climate. That led to us in 2019 doing an enormous piece of analysis on the need for a net zero target, which we advised should be done by 2050. The government of the day took that up and put that into law, and then we moved into, I suppose, an even more interesting piece of work to show in some detail the pathways to achieving that. And it's that leads me to the role I do now. So we built in 2020 five separate pathways for net zero across the whole economy, all of them designed to illustrate different approaches to achieving net zero overall, so quite different scenarios overall. What that allowed us to do, and we are about to receive from the Climate Change Committee the next appraisal of the path to net zero in the form of the appraisal of the 7th carbon budget pathway. But what we were doing in the 6th carbon budget pathway was looking at options deliberately to try and throw them open. And when you have 5 different mutually consistent pathways, you are able to then look across them and see, are there any common features to that? Because any commonality between 5 different scenarios is something that should stand out as a priority for the government to implement. One of those things is clean power. So in each of those 5 pathways, you could say there was a point in the 2030s when the power system was almost fully clean. And the reason we felt it was important for the Climate Change Committee to say that could be called a clean power system is because we felt it was not important to be overly purist about the definition of clean power, that you could still have gas on the power system as long as we were using it at a much reduced rate and call that a clean power system and accelerate the stuff that we would build on top of that to augment that gas-based power system more quickly. And we advised that 2035 was the date that the country should aim for clean power. The government of the day, Boris Johnson's government, was happy to accept that advice. That was an extremely stretching target. Ed Miliband then, in opposition, picked up that analysis and asked why couldn't that be done more quickly. And of course there isn't a physical barrier to doing it more quickly. The question is whether we are willing to fundamentally shift some of the policies that determine the pace of deployment and work hard as a partnership with industry to get these projects delivered. And that is, I think, the basis of the mission, that it is possible for us to move even more quickly on that clean power target. And although that is a relatively narrow goal in terms of climate, cleaning up the power system 5 years earlier delivers some emissions savings, but it's not an enormous in and of itself emissions saving. To achieve clean power by 2030, you must do very broad things, notably reforms to the planning regime and the consenting regime, reforms to policy. These are things that will have wider benefits beyond the power system itself. And the quicker we're able to decarbonise power supply, the simpler the story will be when we come to the bigger challenge of electrifying the end uses that we have for fossil fuels today in transport, in heat and cooling, and in industry. So it does make sense to go fast on this, I think, and to try hard for an earlier date.
Well, my colleagues on the committee are going to have some detailed questions on what you've just been saying in the next hour. Before they do, how will you define success on the delivery plan for clean power? Is there a metric that you will point to in 2030?
So I might bring in Ben in just a second on that, but yes, there is. So I don't think there's a single metric. So already we have defined 2 headline metrics. So the first of those is the percentage of clean in any one year, and we are advised by NESO, the National Energy System Operator, that it is possible to get to less than 5% gas or more than 95% clean in 2030. So that is sort of first headline, aiming for that as the headline metric. The second is that we can produce from clean sources alone more power than is demanded in that year by consumers in Britain, which is a kind of nice metric because it implies, therefore, that we are, with that exported power, decarbonising those countries that we are connected to on the continent. So, there's sort of expression of a wider goal here to assist in reducing emissions across the world. And there's probably a third, which again we haven't made too much of yet, which is a more.
Have you got a number there for the export side of this?
I haven't in front of me. I'm not sure we have defined it more, only to say that it's more than 100. So that goal of producing more than we require. Which is the centre. And then the last of them is straightforwardly grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is an existing metric, and keeping that as low as possible, certainly well below 50 grams.
Okay. Thank you. Polly Billington.
Thanks very much. If the number of organisations was a reflection of the priorities of this government, then perhaps we would see indeed that this is a big deal for this new administration. We have NESO, we have Ofgem, we have the Climate Change Committee, we have now Great British Energy, the National Wealth Fund, the Mission Board and the Mission Control for Clean Power. So as a lifelong civil servant, I am sure you will be able to tell us how they all fit together.
I can tell you how they fit together, but let me first of all acknowledge that is indeed a complicated landscape. And if I may, I'd quite like to knock off from the list one of those organisations, because we are not an organisation. We represent the government in this, and we are not claiming to be a separate organisation from my colleagues back in the department. What we have is a slightly different role from some of my other colleagues back in the department. We are tasked with looking solely at clean power and looking across all government institutions. And I can explain how those things fit together, but I think it is important that we acknowledge that we're going to have to do a job to explain how this fits together in a better and clearer way. And it starts with the energy regulator. We have clearly an energy regulator in Ofgem who looks across all of the regulated institutions. That includes NESO. NESO is now a public body tasked with operating the energy system, but also providing strategic advice and analysis to government, which they have done so on this issue. And we are the policy makers here in government that will set the policies and the direction that allows that environment to work. The Climate Change Committee, in this discussion at least, is ancillary and is an independent advisor on the achievement of our climate goals. But it has traditionally been an institution that has done energy analysis. I think in the future we will look more to NESO to do some of that energy system analysis. It's now tasked with that role as an independent body in the public sector. But we still value the independent view of the Climate Change Committee, because essentially they are tasked very particularly with looking out to 2050, and that kind of perspective is still extremely helpful as you think about the energy system. Now, there are other institutions here. You mentioned GB Energy. That is a new entrant in the energy market itself. It is publicly owned, but it will be operating and will be part of the plan for clean power, but as a member of the energy sector itself. So it is important to make that distinction, because it will be operating and making decisions under its own steam, some of which I very much hope will assist us in achieving clean power.
And the National Wealth Fund?
National Wealth Fund has interests in all sorts of sectors, including the energy sector. Thank you, I'd forgotten that one on the list. But the National Wealth Fund already is a key investor in some of the enabling technologies and enabling industries for clean power by 2030. They've made investments, for example, in cable manufacturing recently, and there are several other aspects of the energy system itself, which it's very, very helpful to have the National Wealth Fund doing that job. It allows us to sort of bridge the gap to some of the key industries and technologies that we know we'll need in 2030 earlier than we might otherwise do if we were looking only to the private markets.
Right, okay. Well, can you explain how the responsibilities of the Mission Board will differ from you at Mission Control and from DESNES? Because I think those are the three kind of key bits.
I'll give bits.
Very, very happy to take that one. Yeah, so the Mission Board is effectively a cabinet subcommittee. So it's a ministerially led board which is led by the Secretary of State with other senior government ministers alongside him. The mission board, if you like, oversees the entirety of the clean energy superpower mission. So I said that we are one of the two limbs alongside accelerating to net zero. So they look across all of that. We very much report into Secretary of State as oversight of the whole mission. So I think the most important thing is to come back to the point Chris made. This is a team in the department reporting to the Secretary of State like any other.
Can I just ask, because you said it was basically a cabinet subcommittee, the Secretary of State very much distinguish it as different from a cabinet subcommittee, because cabinet subcommittees only meet when things are going wrong. So,
you're quite right.
Which I thought was quite an interesting insight from his experience in government. So I would be interested to know how, therefore, we could distinguish this from perhaps cabinet subcommittees.
It definitely doesn't only meet when things are going wrong. It meets on a regular basis and will oversee the mission and have reporting on progress against it.
Thank you very much. Will the department be publishing the minutes of the mission boards? If so, when?
No, it's my understanding is that it's normal practice not to publish minutes of those types of committees.
And how do obviously you're only responsible for one of the 5 missions, but one of them is also the growth mission. So how does your mission integrate with the growth one? We've already had some conversations about that in the national conversation most recently.
Yeah, that we have some national conversations about it. They are very closely aligned in the way that they work together. So the position of the government is absolutely that growth and progress towards net zero and towards clean power are pulling in the same direction. I think it's fair to say that will not always be the case on all things, but overall, this is a strong foundation for growth. And the two missions at official level and indeed at mission board level have been working hand in glove in working together on analysis.
Okay, and just one final question, really, in relation to all of this large sort of ecosystem. The National Wealth Fund and the Great British Energy are supposed to be there really sort of, the language is loosely like filling gaps in the market. But are you confident and what do you see as your role in making sure that they are not crowding out private investment? Do you see that as any part of your role or what?
I think that's probably more a role for those two organisations. I would say they are the people involved in those are quite accomplished in managing to avoid crowding out private investment. A lot of that will come to how they make their investments. I was actually spoke at a conference recently alongside one of the senior officials of the National Wealth Fund. One of the things he said there, which is striking, is at each of these conferences he goes to, he asks if anybody there would like to buy out any of his positions, and he's never had anyone take up that offer yet.
Okay, that's fine. But also, as Chris, you pointed out, quite a lot of this is about the policy landscape within which commercial operations will be working. What therefore what you're doing will have an impact on what the gaps are perhaps in the market because you create or otherwise by the policy framework. So what do you see as your role in creating that framework, which means that National Wealth Fund and GB Energy are not doing things that other people could do?
So let me have a go at that. I mean, I think the sort of logic of what we're trying to do, and it is, I'll say again, extremely stretching. I mean, we're trying to do something extremely difficult here. And the only way we can see to do this and unblock the previous delays that we've seen in deploying infrastructure at the scale that's required is to be more deterministic about what we're trying to achieve. So we start from the basis that we have a plan for 2030. So that is essentially what we've done. We've worked quickly to establish what could be done by 2030 with advice from a different organisation, NISO, which is literally tasked with providing that kind of advice. It was the first report they have ever produced. We then put a plan around that, and the importance of that really is difficult to overstate. It gives a huge amount of certainty about what we are trying to achieve now in the short term in our electricity system. You're right, there is more policy to be done, but in a sense we are giving a signal to the market that this is what that policy will deliver, and trying to develop those policies as quickly as possible is essentially what we wanted to get done quickly to allow us then to move into what you could think of as delivery mode. So, I'm sure there will be more policy to follow, but we have started off as quickly as possible by determining the outcomes of that policy from the start in a much clearer way than was done in previous governments.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, you may be familiar with the words of Adam Bell, the former head of energy strategy at BEIS. He says that Mission Control has very little ability to direct the policy work of the department. this is not mission-led government, but the creation of a new advisory body. If he's right, how will you influence the delivery of policy?
Well, I don't think he is right, so I'm very happy to say that directly to Adam the next time I do see him. But we have a huge amount of influence, and I think that is probably most obvious from what we were able to produce quickly before the tail end of last year. That said, where Adam and I may agree, is that we're not claiming ownership of the policies within that action plan. We are here to steer policies that are quite rightly owned and developed in a department that is very highly functioning at the moment. So our job is to steer those teams that own those policies to deliver what is necessary for 2030 and I suppose to define the outcomes that we are looking for them to achieve. We have very successfully done that, and it's not some sort of power play within the department. This is a very useful new facility that the department has, working directly to the Secretary of State.
Okay. And I think he suggested that the Secretary of State has the option of instructing the Permanent Secretary that they are subordinate to Chris Stark. Is that something you're
very happy to put on the record?
Where does that sit?
Very happy to put on the record that is not my desire, and I work very well with the existing Permanent Secretary, and I don't think it's necessary for us to do that. What I think we have done in establishing the team now focused on clean power is, in a sense, give a bit of headspace to the department to think solely about that and to build a strategy around it. And that is something that is very difficult when you're in, day-to-day working on your policy in your own policy area. You very quickly have managed to set that up, and I think, at least, and Ben may wish to confirm it or otherwise, that departments responded incredibly well to that. So it's not a big team that we've established by design. At the moment, we're somewhere between 40 and 50 people. The team skill set has also changed over time as we've moved from policy setting and policy guiding into the delivery mode that I talked about. That is there to add to what is in the department already and to give a new facility for the department to work even more effectively.
Yeah. Okay. And just to confirm it, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and I can't emphasise enough the importance of us being part of the department rather than separate to it. So we are not advising or influencing officials. We are the officials, and we're absolutely part of that wider team and able to draw on the full expertise of the government department.
Adam Bell has misunderstood.
I think Adam, I wouldn't wish to speak for Adam, but Adam has a very particular view on how this could be done, and it is I think I'm right in saying, a very command and control model. I suppose challenge the notion that is the only way to do this. I think that we are establishing that the command comes essentially from the strategic intent to do what we need to do by 2030, and if everyone lines up behind that, we have a whole department working on this rather than a single team.
Yeah, which is the essence of the mission.
I think it goes right to the top with, and I can say confidently, to the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister himself spends a lot of time talking about this. So we have had the privilege of spending a lot of time with the Prime Minister to talk about clean power by 2030. Okay. So in that sense, it is all subordinate to him.
Yeah, thank you for clearing that up. Big Murphy.
Oh, I thought it was me.
I think I'll come in off the back of.
Okay, now we'll go to Vera Hophouse. Thank you.
Yes, obviously very interested how it all works amongst yourselves. So we've got a set of questions in front of me, but I'm also trying to integrate that in what I've heard. So what direct powers do you then actually have to directly report to the Secretary of State? We're hearing there's no minutes, we don't hear that, so it's more of a conversation. How shall we imagine that?
Well, we don't have any direct powers in this. What we have is, as part of a department that makes policy, those powers, and we have, in a sense, the additional power, if you want to put it that way, of the ear of the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister. So, in a sense, that is the power set that we have before us. That there is a government committed to achieving clean power and a willingness to put the policies in place to do so, and that partnership then extends into the private sector as well. So there's a sort of an additional arm to this, which is our willingness to work with the people who actually deliver these projects, who in almost all cases are actually private developers. So the power comes essentially from the clarity of the intent that we are setting out in the plan that we published last year.
Okay, and then you need to intersect with Treasury Cabinet Office number 10. How is the coordination happening?
So we have a role that is deliberately looking beyond the department alone. So in particular, as we framed up the action plan last year, we thought deeply about planning powers and worked very well indeed with MHCLG colleagues. You will see some of those planning proposals coming through in a new bill that's coming before Parliament in the next few weeks. That is the kind of testament to this thing working. And my colleagues in Treasury, we've also worked very closely with in the preparation of both the analysis and the action plans that we published. DEFRA colleagues, consenting issues here are very large and loom large in the story of how we achieve clean power. And there are others. You could go further than that, go into the Home Office even and talk about things like work permits and Departments of Education for the skills discussion. So there are all sorts of issues here, and the role here is essentially to look beyond the departmental boundaries as much as it's to coordinate what's happening within the department.
You set the general guidance and policy, but you don't plan direct, or you don't manage bids directly for planning and spending.
No, Ben.
We don't. No, there's so the Secretary of State, as in a similar way actually to the Secretary of Transport, some planning proposals come through the department, and he rules on those in a quasi-judicial capacity. The way the department's organised is we have quite strict separation between the people who are doing the policy work and the people who are advising on those formal planning decisions. A lot of planning applications obviously never come into the department at all, they go through other routes, but there's a careful separation there to make sure that we maintain propriety in those.
And within DESNES itself, where does the authority lie between yourselves and the Director Generals for Energy Markets and Supply, Jonathan Milth, and for Net Zero, Lee McDowell?
Yep, happy to. So Jonathan is the SRO for Senior Responsible Officer, as it's called, for the mission as a whole. So he's been tasked with overseeing the Clean Energy Superpower mission. He supports the mission board and the Secretary of State in doing that. We sit slightly separately and report directly into the centre of the department to the Secretary of State, but we work as part of that wider structure with the Directors General and others in the department. So I think it comes back to that. We aren't separate, we are part of the department, and our authority, like Jonathan's, derives entirely from the Secretary of State.
Okay, now to a set of questions outside.
We've actually got Mike's going to ask those. But before he does, I want to go back to what you were saying about the intersection with the Treasury Cabinet Office number 10. Legend has it that no one from outside of those departments has ever managed to influence them in anything other than a minor way. Why do you think you will succeed?
I mean, I think, if I may, I sort of feel that setting up the question as though it's a sort of competition between us is not quite right in the framing of that. So the government has a mission to do clean power by 2030. It is one that is, as much the Treasury's, let's just pick on the Treasury, it's the one that's often cited as being the biggest issue. As much the Treasury's mission as it is mine. That said, understandably, the Treasury has a host of priorities at the moment. To be honest with you, we haven't had these problems because we've been able to move so quickly and bring such immediate clarity to what we're trying to do. I think it helps with the Treasury that what we're doing here also can be done in advance of a spending review more easily perhaps than a brand new big spending programme. So there's the join with the Treasury is often around the growth objective, and there aren't many better things to do than trying to get £40 billion a year of new capital investment into the economy for a very sensible thing that we know we'll need beyond 2030. So we've actually enjoyed huge support from the Treasury. And likewise other bits of government too. I think it comes from understanding firstly that it is not just the DESNES priority, it is the Prime Minister's priority, and the fact that we were straight out of the blocks to try and define it as clearly and as simply as we have. Everyone sort of understands what we need to do now.
Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much, and thanks for appearing before the committee. This is related to a key part of the action plan, the Clean Power 2030 action plan, is around maximising domestic opportunities for clean energy supply chains. I have heard from some industry sources they don't necessarily feel as if necessarily the Clean Energy Action Plan and the Industrial Strategy are sufficiently joined up. There's some concerns about the giga funding that was previously allocated under the previous government. How aligned, how much is ensuring that the UK benefits from that additional economic value that can be created? We heard Adam earlier Berman from Energy UK in the first session talk about the potential opportunities around floating offshore here in particular. Like, are you sufficiently focused on that part, that economic value part creation? Are you having sufficient engagement with the Treasury and the Department for Business and Trade on that point? And are you confident, actually, as the industry is slightly concerned at the moment, about whether we will be able to extract the enough investment from the Treasury in the spending review to deliver on both the aim in the action plan but also the industrial strategy?
So lots in that, but it's a general issue of sort of supply chain and seeing benefit to the supply chain and the workforce from all of this is, I would say, one of the top priorities now. I am absolutely sure we have more to do on this. So just to be very clear, I think this is going to be the job of the next 12 months for us, actually, is that we need to be clearer about in the way in which the supply chain supports the plan that we've set out. We wanted to spend the first 6 months developing the framework for this, and then the broad policy framework that would support that, and put that in an action plan that we could publish before Christmas break, which we did. That allows us to switch then into a different mode of essentially understanding, almost down to project, what is required to achieve that by 2030. We are in the midst of that project-by-project analysis right now. It's probably most advanced for the network projects, so we know that there are 80-plus network projects across the country that are necessary for 2030. It helps that there are only 3 transmission owners doing the programme, and that allows us to look really deeply into some of those supply chain issues. We need to broaden that into the broader set of things that are going on alongside that, including the energy storage projects and the generation projects that we'll be building alongside that network. We are less advanced in understanding the supply chain constraints there. We already have in the department quite a lot of knowledge about the extent of the supply chain for offshore wind, some of the onshore technologies too. We want to sort of bring that together. And the goal of that is to try and understand, I suppose, in the first instance, where we see bottlenecks. So that is true of the supply chain. It is also true of the workforce. The workforce challenge here is huge. I mean, hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country. We want to understand first how you get around that bottleneck, and then second, open up the question of extracting as much value as we can from doing that. So we want to establish the industries that we know we're going to continue to need into the 2030s and 40s, because the story of building out the clean power system doesn't end in 2030. Again, I think the importance of us putting our arms around an actual plan for 2030 is that the developers and the supply chain see that and understand that we're serious about it. But we're going to develop a much deeper sense of where we are facing, a supply chain constraint, and I'm sure we will uncover some of that. Very good piece yesterday in the FT, for example, on some of the electronic components that are required in those network projects. That's something that we can develop a better understanding of because we've got a whole plan for the country. And you can then, of course, build a better case in the industrial strategy, and potentially with investment from the likes of the National Wealth Fund, to establish that manufacturing in the UK, or to have a sensible import strategy, or to invite, indeed, foreign manufacturers to come and produce some of that stuff here. And in a sense, that's the industrial strategy that will sit alongside this. So we will tie that together when the industrial strategy is published. Thank you. Mike Reader.
If it's all right, Chair, I'm going to eat into my time slightly just to ask a couple of follow-up questions, because I'm really interested in the controls environment you're setting up. So understanding, apologies I missed the start of the session, I was in a DL, but you've got a role for assurance of the So how mature would you say the controls environment is within mission control at the moment?
I'll have an initial go at that, and then I'll turn to Ben. So we have a rudimentary dashboard, as we call it at the moment, which is basically a repository of data about some of those key projects that I talked about, alongside some of the headline energy system metrics that I talked about. What essentially we're trying to get to as quickly as we can, and I would say in the first quarter of this year, is a core list of potential projects that we know will matter for 2030. We haven't talked yet about one of the other big reforms that's happening alongside this, which is the reform to the connection queue, which NISO is leading at the moment, and they are doing radical surgery actually to the way in which that connection queue is managed over the next 6 months. We will combine with that. So we should, at the end of that period, have a really strong sense of which projects are likely to be on the system by 2030. And then essentially what we're looking to develop is the schedule of works in each of those projects, so that we can understand when they must be delivered, when they've been promised, A lot of those projects, the network projects, are by regulated asset owners. So we have quite a lot of potential to drive the delivery of that once we can understand it at that level.
I think what I'd add to that is we have the huge advantage that we're doing this in an incredibly data-rich environment. There is a lot of information held by existing teams in the department, by the National Energy System Operator, by Ofgem, by others like the Low Carbon Contracts Company, on the breadth of the projects happening across the country. So we have a huge amount to draw on. There's a lot known about these projects, and we can be really specific about them, the stage they're at. The task for us, I think, now is to draw all of it together into one place in that dashboard and have not just a kind of map of what all of these projects are, but be able to draw inferences, draw insights across them about where are their common challenges, common barriers that we haven't yet addressed, that we still need to work on. I think I'd see it as a maturing thing for us as a unit. We are still quite new. We've set out the pathway, but I think there's still work to do on exactly how we do that kind of tracking, insight, intervention.
I think you'll recognise it in a controls environment. It's not just about the data, governance, reporting,
Absolutely.
Culture, really critical. Are you going to seek any independent assurance of your controls environment, or would you, like P3M3 or similar?
I think we will have to. I mean, again, to be very honest with you, we've focused on developing policies in the first part of our job, and we're now in the middle of rolling into the delivery task. So the control environment for that, as you put it, is exactly what we're discussing in the department right now. So the assurance process above us, actually, that will be, I'm sure we'll want to do some independent appraisal of that. And we'll also want to bring in some expertise to allow us to do that. It's a very different skill set from the one that we've had in the first 6 months.
Talking about bringing expertise, how is Mission Control engaging with the industry?
Well, pretty well.
That's my question.
It's my question, sorry.
Pretty well so far. I mean, we've been able to do so under the guise of the action plan that we've produced. So there's been firstly a process of engagement led by NISO to develop the scenarios that we've essentially adopted in the action plan. And then secondly, we already had a number of industry groups that were up and running, some of which we reframed when the new government came into power, which we've used for the clean power engagement. I think in addition to that, I can tell you I've done a genuinely staggering number of external events to try and make sure that everyone understands what we're trying to do here. We now move into a new phase of work where we'll want to have a deeper relationship with certain developers along that project list that I talked about. So that is the kind of next stage for us, is to develop the closer relationships with key developers.
And you've got 8 commissioners.
Yeah.
Are they advisors, or are they on the ground doing that engagement?
So we didn't talk about the Clean Power Commission, but I'm very happy to do so now. So the idea here is that we have an advisory commission that sits above the challenge that assists us. I chair that group, and it has 8 genuinely excellent experts in various aspects of the challenge before us. They include the likes of Nick Windsor, whose review is the basis of the network upgrades that I referred to earlier, but we have a host of other people represented around the table. That group has been incredibly generous with their time. So we are not meeting, on the odd occasion every couple of months and looking at papers. We're doing full day sessions, and in the run-up to the publication of the action plan, sometimes twice a week, and going deep into the issues. So the idea is that we bring to the Commission, this is definitely a new part of the armoury that we have, actually, is that we can bring into a relatively private space the key people on any one issue and try as best as we can to resolve it in that room, so that we don't waste time with some of the processes that government sadly is afflicted with that cause the delays.
Do you think you've got the right balance of advisors and doers in the function that you have?
It's a very good question, and a good challenge as well. I feel we do at the moment, but again, as we get deeper into the delivery challenges, there's probably a need for some deeper commercial expertise. And although almost everyone on that group has delivered projects at scale commercially, the discipline of doing so and the understanding of some of the key aspects that drive project delays is something that we want to bring in. I don't know whether we'll bring that into the Commission itself or into the team, but that is something we've already identified.
In terms of engaging with devolved governments, how are you doing that in particular with Scotland, because it's quite a different consenting regime?
We've been engaging very closely with the devolved government. So we, in the run-up to the action plan, we've been having very regular, weekly, multiple times a week meetings with Scottish and Welsh governments in particular, obviously, because this is effectively a GB target. I think we'll continue to do that, and one of the things we're looking to do is have, in those regular meetings with the commissioners, we will have some where we meet in a slightly broader group, and we'll invite representatives of governments, but also of Ofgem, of the National Energy System Operator, of others who make a really key contribution to making sure this all comes together as a single system.
Just look at final question for me. Looking at England in particular, got some established strategic authorities. We've now got an announcement today of some newly formed ones, which of course will go through that kind of formation, and then we've got existing councils and others that are left in the current formation. Do you think that period of change is going to help or hinder the role that you have in the delivery of Clean Power 2030?
We haven't done much engagement actually in England within these within the any authority actually at local level. So that is partly by design, because we felt at the moment we were able to do a lot at the national policy level. The engagement we have done has been particularly with the Scottish Government and Welsh Government, because they have, and within that, definitely the Scottish Government and the very separate consenting and planning regime up there. I think it is probably important for us to get to again, once we have the project list that I referred to earlier, it's a little easier for us to develop some of the strategic relationships that we'll need at local authority level. And that is partly because many of those projects that I referred to are not yet through the planning system and might well be in the town and country planning system. So you can imagine us in the future giving some assistance to those key local authorities that really are in the frame for some of those projects. And that is kind of part of the mission thinking, is that moving resource around the system to help with some of that might be something we need to do in the future.
Thank you. Torkel Craig.
Thank you, Chair, Ben, Chris, thanks for coming in. Thanks for your stamina in answering all our questions. Chris, you were on the Climate Change Committee and you recommended a net zero target of 2035, and you've just said just now that was an extremely stretching target.
Yeah.
Now it's a 2030 target. Now, you're amongst friends here. Do you honestly believe we can reach 2030?
I do, but I also think it is by design an optimistic take on that. I mean, I think it's really important that the idea of doing this as a mission is different to the sort of classic ground-up delivery appraisal that you might do. So we are definitely stretching for something that is at the edge of what is possible, in the knowledge that it's going to be very, very useful for us to achieve it. We're pulling through a lot of stuff that we're going to need after 2030. But also safe in the knowledge that we're not going to strand assets on the way as we try to do it. So it's a really well-defined mission in that sense. And I came into it, I freely admit, I came into it thinking this would be super difficult. I mean, this is extraordinarily difficult. And from all the analysis that I'd done at the Climate Change Committee looking at 2035, you could see that. What has been reassuringly surprising is how ready we are, particularly on those network projects. So, in a sense, that is indeed the core of it. If you can build the network we require for 2030, the sort of challenge of connecting what we need to it quickly is quite alluring, actually. So we have a lot of those tools in our disposal to drive the progress that we need. So yes, I think we can achieve it. I wouldn't do this job if I didn't. But the optimism you require to believe it has definitely lessened. I think I'm more and more confident about our ability to bring these key projects home. There will, however, be, I'm sure, things that we haven't yet thought of and obstacles in the way that we haven't yet stumbled across.
You said it would require a kind of fundamental shift from industry and from government and from consumers as well, I expect. And have you made any kind of assessment of what that fast tracking will require or will cost us in terms of having to speed things up, and will cost us perhaps in terms of lost opportunity, because that industrial strategy, that domestic supply chain and all these jobs may not arrive in time for that 2030 target?
I definitely don't view it as...
We could be buying 2030 off the shelf rather than building it here.
So I agree, and in a sense, let me say this, I don't think that's what we're here to do. So we want to try and build it at 2030, of course, but we want to do so in a way that benefits the country in the form of the consumer and the industries that we build alongside it. And that is the point of this. We need to be ready for the phase after that with a stronger domestic story on how we're going to supply it. So I don't see it as a missed opportunity to do all this. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we've got a set of largely domestic developers across the value chain in the energy sector. In your bit of the country even, you've got really important private sector developers that want to support what we're doing here. Most of their supply chain and value is already in this country, so we're pulling that through even more quickly. And what you hear from that sector is, in general, and maybe they're just saying nice things to me, but this is exactly what they want to see. That level of clarity, the fact that we've been able to broker a much stronger relationship with the Scottish Government, and a lot of these projects are wind projects in Scotland, it's just a much better environment to be doing what they do in the private sector, in that sector now.
If we win this prize, we get to 2030, where would that put us in the Euros, in the kind of international league table of decarbonisation?
Right at the top. I mean, we already have an incredibly good story on decarbonising the power sector here in Britain, thanks to our efforts to close coal. We have a golden opportunity, and not every country has this, but a golden period ahead of us where we can continue to rely on the gas fleet that we have in this country to supply flexible electricity that allows us to accommodate particularly wind, but also solar, at a scale that is, going to be incredibly good for those who care about decarbonising power. We can then face into the challenge of what we do with that gas fleet afterwards. Those conditions are fairly unique to Britain, but they allow us to move very, very fast on this. And in a sense, part of what we're trying to do here is to show the value that comes from that to those countries that are slower on this trajectory.
If I could just jump in on that, I think the thing I'd add, coming back to that point about the industrial opportunity of this, there is something quite powerful about getting there first and about being able to say we have a clean power system. There are lots of businesses out there who are investing in lots of things in order to be able to say we are using clean power, and often that can be buying very expensive generation to have for themselves. We're able to say it's coming out of the grid, so invest here and you have clean power immediately.
Okay, having accused you of being perhaps overambitious, can I turn to kind of solar energy, and Solar Energy UK's pressed for 60 gigawatts of solar, and the Secretary of State, when he had it in front of us, said that was a floor, but you've set targets of like 45 to 47 gigawatts. Why?
So, two things to say on this. Firstly, this is the kind of system that the energy system operator says it can operate. Now, I definitely care about having a clean power system, but I also care about having an operable system. So we've followed the advice of NESO on this. Second thing to say is that those numbers that we published are for transmission connected solar, largely, and that there is more scope and potentially much larger scope to do what we call distributed connections at a more local level. So I think the Secretary of State is right. I would of course say that, but I think the Secretary of State is spot on in describing it as a floor. It's a very ambitious floor, but there is scope to add more solar to that.
Okay, so why haven't you uplifted your deployment targets for renewables? Why?
I mean, we have uplifted our targets to an extraordinary degree, but not quite to the numbers that Solar UK might like to see. And the opportunity for solar in particular is to go beyond those targets in a way that it's more difficult to do on something like wind.
Would it help competition if you did?
Would it
help competition in the industry if you did?
It's worth... I wouldn't quite characterise I wouldn't quite characterise these as targets, the ranges that we set out in the plan, if you like. The way NESO framed their advice is these are to some extent limited by what you can physically connect to the grid in that time. So they've prioritised between technologies in terms of what's deliverable, in terms of what's feasible, but also what there's space for. So I don't think we see them as targets to be met and not exceeded. We see them as a guide to what needs to be done in order to deliver 2030 within the boundaries of an operable energy system. I think it is worth saying that on solar in particular, because of that distribution level connection, I'm not sure we're that far apart, actually. No. So we hit 47 gigawatts. There's probably another 9 or 10 gigawatts of credible solar that could be connected at that distribution level. So you get to quite a similar figure.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, I understand some developers are concerned that you haven't really engaged with the industry on what they see ultimately as caps, and you call them targets or... But can you explain why you've done what you've done, and why ultimately there is a concern from some developers that they have felt that the modelling of NESO is not being done very, very correctly, and it's been an outdated model?
Well, NESO did a lot of engagement, very structured engagement across the country as they developed the advice to us. We took the analysis from NESO and developed a policy with NESO about how we collectively would approach connection reform, which we felt to be very, very necessary. And to make the point, I mean, the connection queue contains within it something north of 700 gigawatts of projects, mostly generation and storage projects. It's debatable whether we'll ever need that much. So we had to do something with the queue to make sure that those projects that were most ready to be developed, closest to financial close, able to be brought into operation quickest, could be connected. So I realise that's a difficult process, and it is inevitable with numbers as big as that there will be losers from that process. No one will lose the grid connection. Some of them will be pushed back in time. Some of them will be brought forward in time. We took the decision that was necessary and essential to making progress on this. It's one of the other reasons for doing that is that by rationalising the connection queue in that way to deliver, in a sense, the national targets that we've set, it also frees us up to do new demand connections for new housing developments, new prisons, new schools. Those are also stuck in a queue at the moment as well. So it's very, very important for the growth of the economy that we unblock the connection queue. So I'm of course disappointed that some developers feel they haven't been as consulted as they would like to be. It's not for want of trying on our side, so my door is open definitely if they'd like to discuss that with me.
Just one last thing, what I also hear is some sort of criticism is the definition of what is needed.
Yeah.
And that hasn't been very clear and transparent, and that should possibly also be defined a little bit more clearly to those who want to become developers.
And it's a strategic need. So, and again, there's obviously winners and losers in defining anything like that. And the fact that we're being so deterministic about that and having a plan that contains such specifics about what we're trying to do by technology is what drives that strategic need. What we have done, though, is create these ranges rather than single number targets for each region of the country. We have a range, and that is what allows us to keep the flexibility in the system. So we will curate, to use a term that I occasionally use, curate the grid queue with NESO's support to deliver those ranges. Necessarily, I don't know exactly at this stage about which projects will come on at what date. And really important to say, we've also offered connections out to 2030, or we will offer connections out to 2035 quite deliberately to build in some flexibility beyond 2030 and give developers some certainty about that.
What's your view on the desirability of private wire connections?
So I mean, private wire connections have a really important role, but I don't love them. So in a sense, that the more that we are able to have a flexible, a healthy, flexible, liquid market for a range of technologies that we know we're going to need for clean power by 2030 and beyond, the better. And private wire projects don't usually deliver that. I think there is there's an ability to do private wires as part of this, but I would prefer to aim high and have these projects, whatever they may be, grid connected.
You used the term stranded assets a few minutes ago, and just interested in your sense of the sensitivity around oil and gas, the workers, the communities, the investors and their role in the transition as well, and the impact that having a sensitivity has on your ability to deliver Clean Power 2030.
So we have a huge workforce in oil and gas, something we thought a lot about in the Climate Change Committee. In fact, published some of the most interesting work I think I can say now on how that just transition could play out, particularly for that sector. What we have in this sector complements what needs to happen elsewhere, and it is because we're, again, I mentioned the point I made earlier, that we're in a fairly unique moment in history when essentially the task is to augment what we already have. We've closed coal. I think that has been a very successful transition, and we brought the workforce along with us on that transition. We expect gas to be on the system well into the 2030s.
I think people who suffered in the as the mines closed
all in the power system.
Many
I should
years
clarify.
Ago, might
it's the
disagree
workforce
with you,
in
Chris.
power stations, and although I say that, it's not, even that has not been a simple process. But I have to say it was very important, I think, and great to see that there was a celebration when we closed the final coal power plant in Nottinghamshire last year. And that is testament to that being a well-managed transition. Well-managed transitions still are difficult. The gas transition that we face in the power sector is one that is probably 10 to 15 years away. So we are in the midst now of a really unique moment which we must capitalise on, where we can build on what we have and move those jobs across to the cleaner technologies now while maintaining that gas fleet, so that we're able to then face into the next of those transitions and close off gas at some point in the future.
Excuse me, Chris, but the problem is not in generating power, it's in producing it. It's in offshore jobs in the North Sea.
I'm speaking specifically about the power sector here, and I accept that entirely, but looking beyond the power sector is beyond this mission. So we're not looking at oil and gas supply, except that we are reducing our exposure to some of the globally traded gas that we will have in the power system itself.
Which inevitably has massive consequences for jobs in Scotland and North Sea.
Yeah, I mean, there is an obvious link, isn't there, between the oil and gas industry more widely.
It's partly why I made the point that I did, though, that this is in this sector, in the power sector, the task is to grow the workforce so that we're ready for that transition away from gas in the power sector. The wider issues of what we do in oil and gas go beyond my clean power mission. I'm very happy to talk about work that we've done before at the Climate Change Committee, but there are other officials and other ministers that will handle those issues.
Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much. So planning, problems in planning, storage and infrastructure are all delaying decarbonising the grid. And we heard a lot about that from the previous panel. What levers will Mission Control use to speed up the delivery of essential energy infrastructure?
So we have levers, almost too many of them. So the challenge for us is that we've got a set of projects that are in some shape or form in the planning system already. Most of the projects for 2030 are already in that planning system. We basically need that planning system as it is to work better. That is the core challenge. So the first step here is that the planning system itself will need to be resourced to do so. We can help with that by giving priority to those projects that we know we need for 2030. So that ability to model firstly what we need for 2030, then turn that into reformed connection agreements, gives us a really important sense of priority which we can offer back into the planning system of which projects we actually need to see quickly through planning. That doesn't mean that we're riding roughshod over the planning process itself, it just means that we're able to resource, we should be able to provide the resource to make sure that those projects get the attention they deserve and need. The wider planning issues are, there will be some reforms in the planning and infrastructure bill that you will see in the next few weeks, which have been framed up not solely around the 2030 goal, but because again we've been able to bring the clarity that we have about what's needed for 2030, we are confident about how those reforms will support what we're playing out. And it's difficult to talk about them now because we haven't yet seen the clauses published, but I'm very excited about the extra facilities that we'll get in that infrastructure, in that bill, should it become law. And we've talked about Scotland on a few occasions. One of the other things we're able to do is offer Scotland some shifts in their own planning and consenting regime with primary legislation here, which helps immensely with some of the consenting challenges that we have in Scotland.
I think it's worth maybe, as well as what's coming, setting out some of what we can talk about, which is what's been announced already. So Chris talks about the importance of getting the right resourcing into the planning system. We've already announced £46 million of investment to do exactly that, to build up the resource across the system, across the statutory consultees. We've announced that we'll be increasing resourcing in our own internal, that unit that handles the planning applications for which the Secretary of State has a role. We also announced a number of things in the Clean Power Action Plan directly, such as bringing more onshore wind and other projects into the nationally significant infrastructure system where appropriate, to reform of the national documents that guide that planning process, and of course the recent announcements around the judicial review process and seeking to make that work more effectively so that things move through in the right way while protecting access to justice. So there is movement on this already, as well as what's to come.
I mean, on that point of resources, since 2010, the largest part of government in terms of cuts or reduced expenditure was local government, and probably the worst hit was planning department. Appreciate what you said about sort of 46 million for the planning system, but do you actually think that what's been committed already is enough? Because I think I've heard from industry, and I think there was a concern mentioned earlier by Ed and Berman from Energy UK that actually, even with what's been committed, it may not be enough to deliver. And obviously the government isn't just hoping to deliver on the clean energy projects, but also an enormous amount of other infrastructure and housing developments. Is what's been committed by the government enough? Is more not needed?
I think that's a very fair critique. That we've made a start. There is rather a lot more to do. It's a very complicated system. It's a very complicated system, but it's also a very complicated system to reform and speed up. So we clearly need to go further than what we've done already. The next set of really key reforms will be through that forthcoming primary legislation. But the idea of that is to help the system run smoother, to free up some of the resource, which is very tied up. These are organisations that are to some extent running to stand still. So we're quite clear we need to make their lives easier and make very tightly structured resource go further.
Where we can help, particularly in a world where we are putting extra resource into the planning system, but that doesn't give you an immediate return. And, I've spent 15 years looking at these things. There's never an end to how much extra resource you could put into the planning system, and we absolutely need that. But where we can help is by giving much clearer priority to what the key projects are. So, those projects that are most required, closest to being developed, in the key locations that offer the key strategic advantages that we need. We are able to now identify what those are. So, that is a way in which we can help and drive priority into the planning system itself as we grow the resource.
I mean, this is something I asked the previous panel, but the Clean Power Plan makes several proposals to strengthen nature protection, and one of the advisors on the previous panel suggested that also probably more needed to be done to get the kind of consent, or at least consult with the public.
Yeah.
Yet we've got to deliver an enormous amount of projects in the next 2 years. Can you deliver the level and scale that we need while also protecting nature and bringing people with us? I mean, that's an enormous task. It's not just about delivering the infrastructure, it is about bringing people with us and ensuring that infrastructure is nature positive.
It really is an enormous task, and in the end it's the biggest task before us. And I happen to think, and indeed there's quite a good bit of analysis looking at just the linkage between public sentiment and those nature priorities that you see in countless occasions. One of the people who serves on the Clean Power Commission is Craig Bennett, who's Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trusts. And I invited him to serve on the Commission because he is passionate about our ability to build energy infrastructure alongside what he calls nature's infrastructure. I am very sure it's possible. So I've spent quite a bit of time looking at these issues at the Climate Change Committee. Often hard to measure, but it's definitely possible for us to have restorative practices alongside the need for these new projects and new infrastructure. What is critical to that is the ability to think strategically about it. And what blights us at the moment is that what drives essentially the nature discussion at the moment is an individual discussion, but think of an individual length of cable between point A and point B. What we can do with this is say, look, we have a plan now for the country to 2030. Let's stand back and look at the strategic impacts of that. And then the idea of looking strategically at that and also building in some of the wider and very exciting concepts of strategic compensation allows us, I think, credibly to say that overall we can have a positive impact on nature and site these projects well so that we build the public support for it. The last part of that jigsaw, I think, is that we also need to bring clearer offer to those communities that host that infrastructure. And again, there will be some further measures later this year, I hope, in the planning and infrastructure bill on that front.
Slightly changing tack in terms of the things that could delay decarbonising the grid or indeed potentially benefit consumers in terms of their bills is REMA. We heard from the previous panel, if it comes too close to the next round 7, in terms of CFDs, there is a concern that if zonal pricing, for example, were to be introduced or committed to, even if that's not going to come in until after 2030, developers are going to be making 25-year bets. They normally only have a month to plan. Why is REMA taking so long, and when are we going to see the results, do you think?
So there's a really important piece of work which began in the last administration to look at reform of wholesale electricity market, and we come in the middle of that. So in a sense, our biggest contribution to the REMA discussion, and it is not all about zonal pricing, but zonal pricing is the thing that people, of course, are most concerned about. But our biggest contribution to that REMA discussion overall is essentially to produce an action plan that clarifies the basis on which you then should assess the benefits or otherwise of the REMA package. So, again, by putting such clarity into what we're trying to achieve by 2030, you give a much stronger base from then to which to make an assessment of changes to things like zonal pricing. My other big contribution in coming into this role is to hasten in that whole process to an early decision. So we've committed in the action plan to concluding REMA and making decisions before the summer this year. That is appealing on all sorts of levels. It brings to a close a process that's already lasted more than 2 years, and will bring certainty to an industry that needs it. But also, we just need to complete it, because we will not be able to move forward on some of these enormous infrastructure projects unless there is clarity about how they'll be treated into the future. And you can see how much we've considered and thought about it in the commitment, again, in the action plan, that we would grandfather the existing arrangements for the projects that will go into the next auction round, so that we build as much investor certainty as we can about making that a successful auction.
If REMA doesn't come forward with sufficient time, is it possible that the auction round will be delayed?
No, I don't think so. We've already delayed slightly the auction round so that we can consult on different parameters for that auction round, and the intention there is to try and make it as big and as successful an auction as we can and deliver the best price we can to the consumer. Really important to say that the next auction round, AR7, will be the first where we've had the opportunity to change those parameters. The last auction round, essentially, we inherited the parameters largely that were set in the government before. So we want to make full use of that, because we know that for the 2030 projects, in terms of the really enormous volume of wind that we can produce offshore, we really only have AR7 and AR8, so this auction and the one after it. So we want to make that a success. So that short delay, I mean, I regret any delay, of course, but I think it's worth it, because it will allow us to frame an auction up that is even more successful. I don't see REMA causing a delay to that process, no.
Very, very quickly, because I've already run out of time. Do you have a view on zonal pricing?
I said, interestingly, I don't know whether it's interesting or not, but I said at an event recently, I'm zonal curious.
Oh.
And the reason I say it is because I absolutely see the value of zonal pricing. I am obviously driven by clean power to 2030, so I also see the potential for a chilling effect on that investment. And it's very, to give a sort of more straightforward answer to it, the most obvious thing to do in a world where REMA is looking at addressing these price differentials that we get across the country when the wind blows in the north and doesn't in the south, for example, the most obvious short-term thing to do is what we've announced we will do, which is to build the network to relieve the constraints north to south. So the kind of most important short-term thing to do is to construct the network that we need. And that is where we've been, I think, most ambitious in accepting the plans of the transmission operators to build the network that we require for 2030. In a sense, that slightly reduces the signal that REMA is trying to address, but I don't think it goes away altogether. So we will have situations in the future, particularly as we build out that renewables fleet, where the issues that the REMA team are considering become more and more pressing. So I think it's very important that we address them. That's not just a 2030 concern, though. That should look out beyond 2030 into the 2030s and beyond.
Rather than asking you to get off the fence.
I am on the fence, though.
Yeah,
I mean, I do mean it genuinely. I'm not hiding something.
Understood. A number of developers are saying to us that zonal pricing will make it impossible for you to achieve clean power 2030.
Yeah.
How do you respond?
I don't think that's true, but I do think any change is tricky to manage. I mean, I think the importance of bringing that process to an early conclusion is that we need to give as much clarity early as we can about any change. And I think there isn't a world where we stand still on some of these issues. So, broadly, just to deal with the zonal pricing issue, you broadly have two options. One is the zonal pricing option. The other is some reform to the existing single GB price that we have. In both worlds, there is change. And I'm confident that the developers in the private sector can accommodate that. What I think we need to do is give them the clarity about how it will be treated, so that they're able to bid keenly in whatever auction they're able to join.
Yeah, that's helpful. Talk Crichton.
Thanks, Chair. Hello again, guys. Can I ask a few questions about carbon capture and storage? We heard evidence in our earlier session from the Green Alliance that CSS would just have a limited contribution to the 2030 targets. Do you think CSS will make any meaningful contribution to 2030?
I really do, and it's super important that it does. So back to the analysis that we've been talking about from NISO, what they showed very clearly is that there's a huge value to having what they call clean dispatchable power. It's basically something that gives you basically the properties of a gas-fired power station today without the emissions. There's a couple of ways you can do that, in fact many ways in which you can do that, but one is gas with CCS, the other is something like hydrogen to power. Both of those technologies are going to be very, very important for this country, I think, into the 2030s. And I do think it is credible now for us to have gas CCS on the system by 2030.
Gas CCS, is that new build gas stations that takes carbon out, or do you retrofit the existing gas stations?
It's new. The projects we're looking at would be new build on the cluster sites that are being supported with the CCS support that the government announced last year.
All that's very expensive. Who should be paying for that, the consumer or the investor?
It is, well, it's a combination of both, but the cost of those projects is indeed big, and they are first of a kind for this country at least. The value to the system is enormous. So you can see that most obviously in the NISO analysis, that you, by having a little bit of clean dispatchable power on the system, you need far less by way of deployment of some of the other technology that you need. So having the flexibility that comes with that gas CCS is the real value to the system, and it's worth paying for. So although the projects itself are expensive, they demonstrate really important technology that the world will need, and we also demonstrate that the UK is a place to do CCS. Yeah. But they also have a big value to the power system itself.
Who should pay, the industry or the public?
Well, in the end, all these costs must be recovered somehow. So we have a taxpayer and bill payer challenge, and you can't really duck it. It's got to be one of the two.
So the consumer?
No, actually. I think it's important to say that the balance between bill payers and taxpayers is really the only tool we have in our disposal. It'd be nice if we could ask developers to pay for it, but they generally want a return on their investments. So that is the challenge before us. What is the best way to do it, not whether we should do it.
Nesta have got a proposal for balancing the levies between electricity and gas. What's your view on what they're saying?
I can't hide from the fact that I spent nearly 7 years saying it's very, very important that we make electricity cheaper, and it continues to be my view in this job that we should do so. And that sort of relative balance between the gas price and the electricity price, the ratio between those two things, is going to be so important, because the cheaper we make electricity, the easier the story of decarbonising will become, because electrifying transport and heat and industry itself just takes...
Helps you to achieve, think about 2030, yeah.
It will do, yeah, because the sort of demand will be there, and I think it's kind of another aspect. There's nothing simple in any of this, sadly, but the demand that we need for electricity, if we build that out quick, and if it's flexible demand, we're able to build even more renewables and even more clean power to substantiate it, and to have that is a sort of happy marriage, basically, that new flexible demand driven by, I hope, cheaper electricity prices.
You finished?
Is your final question on nuclear? I'm finished with my question.
I jumped in. No, I'll carry on. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the answer about levies. We heard a lot from the previous panel about demand management, which they thoroughly recommend, and they think we heard evidence that the commitment in the Warm Homes Plan doesn't go in nearly far enough. What's your sense of what is possible with demand management?
So the clearest and simplest way for us to be more efficient, if I can put it that way, in our use of energy is to electrify. So in a sense, my main goal is to drive electrification as fast as we can. The reason that's important is because fossil fuels, when we burn them, are incredibly wasteful. So they're a wasteful source of energy in the sense that there's a huge loss of energy through heat loss. You don't get that with electrified technologies. So as we electrify and as we supply the electricity that the nation needs with clean sources, we will drive enormous energy efficiencies across the economy. It's one of the reasons why the size of the energy system that we have today, and I say energy deliberately here, can actually be smaller in the future even though we have abundant electricity supplies, because the technologies themselves, electrical technologies themselves, are so energy efficient. So I think our biggest contribution to the story on demand reduction is to drive electrification generally. The other side of the demand story, though, is demand flexibility, and we have really kind of nailed our colours to the mast on that. We have been very ambitious about driving consumer-led flexibility. We want to see the key technologies being used, and by that I mean solar, batteries, electric vehicle charging, to drive a revolution actually in the way in which we might see flexible demand on the system. And that the reason for that is because for those consumers that want it, that is also a source of saving. We can save energy and of course save costs because you're able to play in that market where when the wind blows or the sun shines, it's cheap.
Okay. Yeah, I'll come to you in a moment. Just something that follows on here, and I'm talking about AI in energy.
Yes.
I mean, has your thinking evolved in recent days and weeks, Chris Stark? I mean, the evidence I've been hearing is that there is potentially significant efficiencies to be had, but there is a concern about the amount of energy used to get there, and maybe one cancels out the other. Where are you in the early thinking on this?
So overall, at national level, even very radical increases in electricity demand across the whole of Great Britain are manageable in terms of the national pathways that we're following to 2030 and beyond. I don't know what the new energy demand from data centres will be. All I know is it will be substantial, and I think it's very, very important that we as a country support that compute power, because it's really exciting to have it here. The energy demands from it are highly uncertain, partly because the location of the investment is highly uncertain, the energy demand itself is highly uncertain, and the technologies within those data centres also uncertain. We're seeing efficiencies all the time in AI. My ambition is to never have a situation where we are forced to delay or refuse a connection request for one of those data centres. So that requires us to think of that as a core part of this mission. And potentially this matches up incredibly well with what we're trying to do on the supply side. So I suppose that's what we bring to it, is that in a world of uncertainty, all we know is that this could be a very significant new source of demand, one that we think we can accommodate in terms of the aggregate position, but one which is largely a challenge of making sure that there's a grid connection available for that new data centre, wherever it may be. And the government has set out its ambitions for AI. Part of that is to try and facilitate AI in certain parts of the country, and those parts of the country will need to be ready to accommodate those grid connections when they're made and requested. I think we can do it, basically.
Yeah, and the waste heat from data centres is considerable. Do you see it as being a contributor to heat networks? There are examples of this happening, and there are examples where it's not been possible.
Yeah.
Is that something you're
more dubious about that, if I'm honest with you, because I think the waste heat is there, and I can understand how it could be reprocessed and put into a heat network. And it would be great to see that happen. But it is probably easiest to do that when you are co-located near a city. Now, some of those data centres might have those characteristics, in which case we shouldn't waste any of that heat. But if you're in a sort of rural setting or somewhere that's far away from an urban conurbation, it is difficult to capture that heat and use it. Yeah. So best that we admit that.
Vera Hophouse.
Since we are in this sort of world of new technologies and uncertainties, what about flexible heat batteries? I understand there's producers, but it needs the typical sort of drivers and interventions from government, the department, to sort of help the users to use them and to switch. How quickly can the department actually sort of create incentives very quickly around technologies where you have a rough idea about what it's going to deliver, but it is still new technology? So what about actually new technologies? How quickly can you create these incentives?
It's worth saying that the decarbonisation of heat is probably at the edge of what we're doing in the Clean Power Mission, but it is still in it. We're still, it's still important. And the area where it is most important is because those electrified heat technologies, if they are as flexible as a home that has a heat battery in it, for example, that's of great use to us in a world where the the power system itself is becoming more variable overall. So we certainly have an interest in seeing those technologies deployed. And I'm really excited personally about some of those technologies. There's a company called SunAmp in Scotland that I know very well that produces those heat batteries. It's a great domestic success. You can see how important they will be to the story overall of electrified heat and of energy efficiency improvements at household level. Best to be honest with you, it has not been forefront of the work that we've done on clean power so far, but it is within that line on consumer-led flexibility. And we would want to see as much of that as we can on the system by 2030. So anything that the government can do to support that fits extremely well with the clean power mission.
Big Murphy.
Just on flex, when we had Ofgem in front of us, we had a conversation about the fact that when we think about switching, there's actually only there's probably an upper limit when it's about the number of people that really make use of switching, for example, and even some of the most energy informed consumers are quite time poor, and the more time poor you are, the less time you're going to have, frankly, to engage in a flexible market where you're worrying about putting your washing machine on at 4 a.m. and I know being slightly facetious, but that so how much time is being thought about how you design a system, a flex system that works for all sorts of consumers, and not just those who have the time, frankly, and the will to engage in a system like that. And then there's also another point, which is about who decides, because there are some models out there where it's actually the supplier that's deciding when to take from the battery and when to, and that brings its own risks, because if someone suddenly wakes up and needs to use their car and they find that it's been drained of battery. So, I'm not necessarily asking you to speak to those examples, but who is thinking about how that system is designed, who controls it, and who benefits from it?
Yeah, so this is something we're really very interested in and very engaged with, and I think there's a lot in this. So we talked in the action plan about trying to aim for something like 10 to 12 gigawatts of consumer-led flex, which takes all sorts of forms. That compares to 2.5-ish on the system now. I think the form that takes is going to vary, and I'll speak to some of that. There is a key principle behind it, which is this needs to be something the consumer signs up to and is happy with. So in those examples where there might actually be some consumers who would really like a more automated version of this, where it's built into the tariff, you agree with your supplier, they do alter when your car's charging in the middle of the night, whatever the system might be. But that's something you've signed up to because it saves you money as a consumer, it contributes to the system, whatever's your motivation. This shouldn't be happening to anyone, it should be happening with. There's a lot of really important enabling work that happens with that. So this concept of market-wide half-hourly settlement, which is something Ofgem are working to deliver, is something that means that the market's much more exposed in real time to the costs, if you like, and that enables these kind of very flexible, very quite innovative contracts. Those then become even more enabled by the advent of all of these technologies, heat batteries, actual batteries, electric cars. So I think there's a lot in this. We've committed as government to a flexibility roadmap, which we'll publish in the summer. That's trying to draw a lot of these things together to set out how this might work, how we operationalise that. A lot of that is around quite technical things in the design of the market, but it's critical to clean power, and actually 10 to 12 gigawatts of flex means 10 to 12 gigawatts of generation you don't need, which is a significant system saving and a bill saving ultimately for everyone, whether you're doing the flex or not.
Just sort of very quickly, do you worry that it's only capital-rich consumers that are going to be able to benefit, because it's only if you can invest in an EV, a heat battery, etc., then you're the only ones that are going to be able to benefit from that system?
Well, that's why I think a couple of things are important in that. One is I think there is a reality that, to start with a lot of these things, it often is the wealthier or the more actively engaged consumers that benefit first when you sort of get these new market models. I think that's a reality of these things, but they then tend to spread. The key thing there is that there is a system cost benefit to this if we get this right, and if even if it's a relatively small consumer base that really actively participates in those sort of flex things, there's a system cost benefit to having lots of consumer-led flex in the system, in that the whole system gets cheaper. That cost is felt by everybody on their bills. I think the other point is we're looking to the energy system try and implement this in a lot of different ways. So absolutely, it might be that the greatest immediate benefits are felt if you have access to technologies like an electric car and you are one of those first movers. But there are lots of smaller things, and we're seeing some of them already, like consumers being paid to just turn on the washing machine overnight rather than between 4 and 7 p.m. So I think there are lots of smaller ways in which a lot of people could benefit early, but the system-wide costs will be felt by all consumers.
We had a discussion in the previous panel about the importance of taking people with, of communication, of getting support. How much of your role is in building that consumer support?
It's not explicit, but I do think it's essential. So one of the roles I've taken on in leading this work is to be more present externally and to be willing to engage with people, as well as we have naturally focused on the developer community initially. And there's never an end to the number of trade groups that you can meet, as I'm sure MPs suffer the same issues. So the sort of desire to meet is never ending. The bit I don't want to miss is the fact that we are going to have to also talk to people about what we're doing here. And in particular, to take the sting out of some of this, I think this story that is occasionally told that we're sort of going to carpet the country in infrastructure. It's not true. So I think it's really important that we talk about this. As a host of benefits come with this, notably with that level of investment that we're targeting, very big economic benefit. The jobs story is very exciting, and that story that we've just talked about of more flexible energy system, if it's consumer-led, as we intend it to be, absolutely we want to turn that story on its head, where it's those consumers who are least able to pay who should benefit most from the technologies that give you that flexibility. Now, I think there's a host of things here that need to be described well. I can do some of that. I'm certain ministers can do some of that. There's a sort of broader question here about who are the right people to bring that to the country, and maybe that's an Ed Miliband fronted campaign on your telly, but actually I tend to think we just got to start with laying out very clearly what it is we're trying to do here. It's
just to ask you whether that's a recommendation.
Exactly, we pushed that straight up.
Not answered.
But we need to be laying this out, I think, clearly, and of course publishing an action plan allows us to come before you and talk about what's in it. Yeah, sure. But that isn't a public information campaign. Now we do have one planned for later this year, as do the electricity networks in particular, to talk about the Great Grid Upgrade, as they call it. That is kind of part one of this, I think, and bringing clarity to what we're trying to do, I tend to think helps us immensely with the messages.
It struck me when Ben Golding, when you were talking about the simple. I mean, as Luke teed you up beautifully with the 4 a.m. I think I set mine at 1 a.m. not 4 a.m. But anyway, but that's such an easy thing for people to understand, isn't it? I mean, is it really about taking it down and making it that simple for people?
I think it is about making it simple. I think there's two aspects to this. One is that there is a certain amount of this that most people in the country won't see or feel at all, and that's absolutely fine. If this happens in the background and it makes your bills ultimately a bit cheaper, and if it insulates you from the sort of price spikes we saw a year or two ago, that's fantastic on its own. But where people do engage with this, where they do see it, I think there is a huge amount of this which is about making it simple, easy to understand, engage with if you want to, and then changing some of the narrative around it. So we talked earlier about the nature positive approach to this. Actually, there's a massive opportunity in some of these things for communities that host this infrastructure to do it in a way which comes with a wildlife meadow underneath your solar farm, comes with a nature corridor under those pylons. So turning this into something which actually positively impacts nature, impacts communities, and impacts people's daily lives feels hugely valuable.
Thank you very much. Dr. Crichton, do you want to ask some questions about nuclear?
It was the final
go for it.
London-style last question.
We've had this before where we said this is a final question, then another 3 or 4 hands go up. So we'll warn you.
One more question.
Yeah. Well, it comes from the Secretary of State. Actually, he stressed that he sees nuclear power playing a very important part in the electricity mix. Yet E3G, the think tank's recent power report, was very critical of nuclear. It suggests it's vulnerable to delays, to closures. It's expensive, and we just wonder what your view is on the role of nuclear in reaching 2030.
There's an enormously important role for nuclear reaching 2030 because we're relying on an existing nuclear fleet that we would like to see safely operating for as long as possible. Now we have more clarity on that from the nuclear regulator now, who's given us clarity along with the operators about how much longer we can expect nuclear to be in the system. And happily, we're going to have more on the system than I feared when I began this job in 2030, and that helps immensely. Internally, we call that the hump. The sort of getting over the hump and having nuclear in the system helps immensely with that. The other story on nuclear pre-2030 is a hope that one unit of Hinkley Point will be on by 2030, and the developer tells me it will, so we need to make sure that that's delivered. But the story of nuclear will also be playing out over that period, new nuclear playing out over the period to 2030. So I think we do need some new nuclear beyond 2030, and again, you can look to the advice of the Climate Change Committee and others to show that it will probably be producing an important, offering an important contribution in whatever pathway we take to net zero. And nuclear itself, new nuclear, is something that this government will shortly be able to say more about.
That was my final question, but if I can ask a final substitute question on behalf of Josh MacArthur, who isn't here. Do you agree that action needs to be taken to ensure appointments are made more swiftly to arm's length bodies related to nuclear, most notably British nuclear?
Yes, let me say, I think that is always a good aim, and we don't mess about in the Clean Power Unit, so we're keen to see every process in government act more quickly.
When shall we see an appointment?
I don't have an answer for that question, I'm sorry.
Thank you, both of you, very much for going on so long. That's our fault, not yours. And for your answers, and I hope you are looking forward to coming back soon, and
of course,
and repeatedly to update us on your progress. Chris Stark, Ben Goulding, thank you. The session is ended. Order.